the rise of a young Fire Nation commander Xing, a survivor of a village attack turned prodigious firebending colonel of the Fire Nation's 11th Regiment. Taking place not long before canon, Xing seeks to keep his adoptive family in the Fire Nation military as safe, sound, and sharp as he can, even as the pieces of the puzzle that is the main story start to fall into place around him. The biggest of which is Princess Azula joining the 11th in their military duties around the Earth Kingdom. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What if Azula found a Chad boyfriend? AU Avatar, The Last Airbender, Part 1. If you enjoy this type of content, please gracefully strike the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Remember to check out the original story linked in the description. Without further ado, let's get into the legend of the man who tamed Azula.
行くぜ
96 AG. The royal palace was abuzz with higher than usual activity. Nobles and generals assembled within the great throne room. They prostrated themselves on the glossy black floor, awaiting the presence of their fire lord. The roar of flames announced his arrival, as a curtain of fire arose to obscure the throne and its raised platform. All eyes were kept down, though keen ears picked up the soft swish of royal robes as the fire lord finally sat down. The Fire Lord now presides over this court, announced some unseen voice. Arise, came the curt voice of Fire Lord Ozai. The command was obeyed instantly, and the hundreds of the Fire Nation's courtiers snapped up to their feet in a mix of robes and hard armor. The royal court was in session, and the latest changes to the Fire Nation were discussed. Nobles reported on the growth of colonies, and humbly boasted about their contributions in taxes. Generals updated the court on the latest shifts to the many war fronts, as well as crowing on particular victories over their enemies. It would be just another day in court, if not for the last item on the agenda. The court calls for the presence of Xing. There was a sharp clatter of armor as someone arose and marched with stiff precision. A soft murmur rose up as the courtiers noted a small figure in oversized armor dropping to one knee before the flame-obscured throne. Their arms snapped up in a supplicant salute, palm over fist. Conscript Xing of the 11th Regiment kneels before the Fire Lord. The voice was from a young boy, sharpened and hardened through military discipline and frequent combat. More murmuring followed at the oddity. Even the princess had surprise flash across her face for the briefest of moments before frowning heavily at the kneeling soldier. It seemed that the rumors about the defiant 11th were true then. Fire Lord Ozai's voice betrayed none of the reactions of his court. There was no bafflement or doubt as he spoke. No one would be stupid enough to dare risk the wrath of the Fire Lord with an ill-thought-out prank like this. Conscript Xing, your name has reached the throne filled with much praise by the officers of the 11th Regiment. I am flattered that they regard me so, Your Majesty, came the sharp, almost curt reply, Xing's head never rising. The older, more experienced courtiers could pick the tinge of sourness in the boy's words. This child soldier was reluctant to be here. Indeed, the silhouette behind the curtain of fire shifted as the Fire Lord leaned forward a fraction. Tell me, how fares the 11th? There was a second's pause before Xing answered. We are heavily depleted, Lord, but the soldiers remaining stand ready to enact your orders. Only the densest among the assembly failed to notice the use of we. Is that so? How much then was the report on the late General Sherlaw's failure downplayed? The murmurs faded to a strangled silence as all ears awaited the reply. Despite official reports, it didn't take a great sage to decipher just how much of a disaster the Battle of Tai Plains had been. The bumbling of the 11th's new general almost cost the lives of multiple army groups, if not for the 11th Regiment redeeming its honor with a valiant rearguard action. Xing audibly sighed. General Sherluo had been most adamant about his tactics, ignoring the advice of Captains Kai and Mosey, and even Colonels Dao and Koda. After receiving tense silence for a few seconds, he continued. Scout reports that the Earth Kingdom had been sighted on the battlefield the night before the battle were ignored. News of the Earth Kingdom line being reorganized was similarly discounted. General Sherluo insisted that the 11th Regiment's reputation for tenacity would carry it to victory regardless of what the enemy had planned. He personally led the charge against the Earth Kingdom's waiting host. Soft gasps filled the throne room at the description of such incompetence. The generals in particular frowned heavily with disapproval. The bitterness was thick in the boy's voice, but it did not waver at all. The battle was lost as soon as the charge was ordered. General Sherluo and his personal guard were the first to fall into the spiked pit traps. If not for Colonel Dao's and Colonel Yashin's quick thinking, the 11th Regiment would have been eradicated as the Earthbenders attempted to bury us alive, while the other forces involved would have suffered far heavier losses. Colonel Dao, the Fire Lord, summoned sternly, and the graying warrior who led the venerable 4th Regiment knelt beside Xing before the wall of fire. For his part, the boy seemed to stiffen a bit at the colonel's presence. Your reports mentioned that it was conscript Xing that salvaged the defeat. The colonel gave a curt nod while staring at the space just below the flames. Yes, Fire Lord. Myself and the other colonels saw with our own eyes as Xing marshaled the remnants of the 11th to keep the center from breaking. If not for that, the retreat would have been a bloody rout. When we assisted their breakout, the survivors of the 11th were all covered in blood and wounds, conscript Xing being no exception. Heavy silence returned once more, though trepidation was mixed with incredulity. It seems you have downplayed your own achievements, conscript Xing. The boy managed to lower his head further. Colonel Dao flatters my accomplishments, Fire Lord. I merely looked out for my comrades selfishly. Is that so? Ozai wondered aloud, causing many experienced courtiers to flinch. Colonel Dao, what is your assessment of this conscript thus far? The reply came without hesitation, full of conviction. The tales of the young dragon holds notable grains of truth, Your Majesty. Even if he seeks to hide it out of humbleness, it is clear that Xing is regarded highly by the 11th. The officers have admitted that up until General Sherluo's arrival, it is Xing's advice that the captains follow. And it is with such advice that has, until Tai Plains, earned the 11th much merit even after the loss of Colonel Li Dai. This time the ambient mutterings became a buzzing din that echoed throughout the throne room. A gaggle of commanders exchanged heated words, while some nobles debated the veracity of such a bold claim. The men exaggerate, Your Majesty. I only dash silence. The Fire Lord's command cut through the noise, and silence reigned again. Conscript Xing, Ozai slowly enunciated the boy's name and paltry title carefully. Were it any other case, the unlawful assumption of command of any Fire Nation force is a crime punishable by death. However, Colonel Koda, Colonel Shou, the named generals marched out to form a line with Xing and Colonel Dao. Let me ask, for the record to be clear, do you stand by your claims of the vaunted young dragon of the 11th? Yes, Fire Lord, they answered in unison and without hesitation, ignoring the not-too-subtle sideways glare from the boy. Some courtiers could have sworn they saw the older colonels smile a bit. Throughout the brief cooperation between our armies, it was clear that the conscript had been the true strategist behind the 11th's brilliant victories, Colonel Shou stated. I have personally witnessed his valor in combat as well, and the tales of the young dragon's fearsomeness is well earned. So much so that the Earth Kingdom clearly focused their full might on destroying the 11th Regiment on Tai Plains to be rid of him. Colonel Yashin and his officers all have confirmed without discrepancies that they had witnessed conscript Xing slay several Earth Kingdom champions before they retrieved him, even though he himself had sustained grievous wounds. Colonel Koda added, it can be safe to say that other rumors of his competence holds true as well. The soft roars from the curtain of fire filled the ears of all who attended, as utter silence reigned for several minutes. Conscript Xing. Ozai finally addressed Xing once more in a deeper, more formal tone, while the shadow behind the flames rose from the throne. The generals and nobles immediately bowed deeply in deference. The Fire Nation has judged your usurpation of one of its forces to be a grave crime that is long overdue to be rectified. Dread anticipation filled in the air. The generals in particular tensed as they awaited their Fire Lord's verdict. Yet, if even half of what has been claimed about you is true, it would be a larger crime to the Fire Nation to discard such a talented and loyal warrior, especially if such talent compensates for the lacking in some of our appointed generals. A shadow of an arm swept out declaratively from behind the wall of flames. Henceforth, effective immediately, you are elevated to the rank of Colonel of the 11th Regiment, as befitting your long overlooked merits. Arise, Colonel Xing, and continue to lead the 11th Regiment to victory and glory for the Fire Nation." Relief and some annoyance flooded the great hall, though few noticed how the newly promoted general remained utterly still. "Your Majesty is most generous," Xing replied, bowing his head before finally rising from his kneeling position. "I will strive to earn the trust bestowed upon me." "Congratulations, brat," Colonel Dao said after the royal court had adjourned and they were outside the throne room. The burly, aging man slapped Xing across the shoulder, almost knocking the boy over. "I told you the Fire Lord rewards good work." The new colonel readjusted his pauldron and sighed. "With all due respect, Colonel Dao, but may a pod of flying fishopotamus drown you in their shit." The older commander cackled heartily at the curse, causing some eavesdropping nobles to shake their heads with disapproval. "Come now, is that how a colonel should speak?" Colonel Koda said, joining the two along with Colonel Shou. "Aren't all of you supposed to be at the front lines still, and misregaling everyone about your tales? Dao is right, lad. You've earned this. Be proud." I'm sure Li Dai would have been beaming with pride if he were here. At the mention of the respected colonel that took him in, Xing's annoyance melted into somberness. It is a shame that it took tragedy upon tragedy for this. He gestured downwards with his hands. To occur, Colonel Shou patted the boy on the back, much more softly than Dao did. Now, none of that. Li Dai wouldn't want you to wallow like this. We all grieve for his loss, but Li Dai's memory should be honored, especially his aspirations for you. I'm sure the old man's proud of you." There were nods all around, and Dao gave Xing another hearty thwack on the shoulder. "Come, brat. Let us uncles guide you through the paperwork. Then once you're done, we'll dash, no?" Shou cut him off with a glare. "Xing's still too young to drink. But dash or visit those women. Bah, Killjoy." The three older colonels formed a protective triangle around their new, much younger colleague, keeping Xing protected from sniveling nobles and other court sycophants as they headed towards the Fire Army's headquarters to officially register Xing's new rank and secure all the perks that came with it. They would regale about the boy's feats later. After all, they first needed to reaffirm their story about Sherlua's demise. Watching the quartet from a distance, Fire Princess Azula stared hard at the back of the boy barely older than her. She recalled the exploits attributed to the young dragon, and found it both hard and easy to match it to his face. Hard because, well, how is a mere boy capable of challenging and defeating 3 Earth Kingdom generals at the same time? Or surviving impalement from multiple spears and stones suffered during the rearguard defense from the defeat at Tai Plains? How was a boy supposed to be the great mastermind that led a depleted army to victory upon impossible victory? But on the other hand, Princess saw the way he carried himself, as well as the iron resolve in his eyes. Determined eyes which fit someone who could lead 500 soldiers against 3,000, and win so decisively that the casualties they took were only seriously wounded at the worst. Young dragon indeed. This Xing might be interesting enough to warrant some investigation. "So, Colonel, Don't start, Captain Run." Xing shot back at the woman, waggling her eyebrows at him as he took a seat by the tavern's table, causing her to scowl. "Ugh, don't remind me. The pay raise from lieutenant to captain isn't worth the workload." She leaned back in her chair and huffed petulantly. "Why'd you have to promote me anyway? The rank scares all the sweet, cute soldiers away, and draws in all the brainless court weaklings." Xing shook his head with exasperation, picking up and gently swirling a bowl of tea in his hand. Neither soldier paid the serving girl, or the other staring clientele, any mind. "I've been given orders to rebuild the 11th Regiment, which means reviving 3 whole battalions and filling in the existing empty one. You, Weikong, Rufin, and Ping will be in charge of that." Run winced at the reminder of the 11th's near-broken state. Even under Colonel Li Dai, attrition had whittled the 11th Division to half strength, and the disaster at Tai Plains had brought it down to 1.5 battalions. A lot of good men and women lost to the warriors of the Earth Kingdom and Water Tribes. But the greatest shame were those lost to the folly of the prick Sherluo. If he wasn't already dead, Run and the others would have gladly forfeit their ranks just to repay his idiocy. "So who's your lieutenant colonel?" Rin asked to distract her from those dark thoughts. "I was thinking Mosey," the boy said thoughtfully, and Rin nodded her agreement. "Yeah, Mosey's reliable. Kai treats you too much like a younger brother." Xing gave a lopsided grin. "You should know. Puffed. Everyone knows me and Kai are fighting over who gets to adopt you. Say, you know the current odds for that?" 9-6, favoring you. Last I heard, the colonel replied with a smirk. Rin grinned triumphantly. Damn right. Though, now that you've made rank, I guess you don't need to be tied down by lower families, eh? Her eyebrows started waggling again. Gonna catch some young, sweet girl and introduce her to your young dragon. The faintest of blushes crept up on Xing's cheeks, but otherwise he kept up an unamused mask. Keep up your crassness, and it's no wonder you're not getting any good catches yourself, Captain. Now that's just low. They settled for a comfortable silence, never acknowledging the rest of the tavern goers. As Xing sipped from his tea bowl and Ren began emptying her mug of rice liquor, the soon-to-be-promoted Mosey entered, with Captain Kai in tow. The latter wore a huge, proud grin as he quickly closed the distance to grab Xing off his seat in a crushing hug. Congratulations, Xing. Kai put the colonel down, Mosey stated evenly, eyeing the bystanders a little awkwardly. We're in public, and with your strength, it might be considered an assault on a superior officer. The burly commander dropped his much younger leader down with an apologetic smile, and then had the decency to offer sheepish nods to the people in the tavern before he took a seat by the table. Oops. Sorry about that, Colonel. Xing rolled his eyes as he waved it off. No problem, Kai. How was the royal quartermaster? Surprisingly accommodating, Mosey answered as he joined them and called for a serving girl. The 11th Regiment will get all it needs. We now just need the bodies. Kai grinned cheerily. Well, with how the news is spreading around, I'm sure we won't have recruitment problems. Good thing we have a generous time limit. Mosey agreed with a sagely nod before changing the topic. Have you seen to your new accommodations yet, Colonel? Xing gave a shrug. Just a quick look. General Sherlock's taste was not too gaudy, thankfully. I suppose that's one virtue the Beeb late general had, Rin remarked, her expression along with the other two colonels turning dark at the mention of the bumbling fool's name. The 11th Regiment would not forget the damage he'd done to them anytime soon. The conversation ended on that sour note, partly due to the food finally arriving. The four of them ate with a gusto that betrayed the sense of urgency that still clung to them out of combat. They left after a brief scuffle of who had the rights to pay. Kai won by being the first to reach the tavern keep, and all signs of joviality fled as soon as their feet left the establishment's door. None of them are following us, Mosey mumbled under his breath. Xing kept his gaze fixed to the front. We've satisfied their curiosity. Were any of them recognizable? One of them's from Count Mura, Kai replied with the same near silence with a thoughtful frown, trying to recall his life as a minor noble before his commission, and all the social pageantry that came with it. I think. The table in the back end had Marquis Bose and Countess Shio's people, Ren added, her lips barely moving. As a distant cousin of a duke, she too had experience in the pretentious circle of the Fire Nation's nobility. Will any of them be a problem? The young colonel asked. Ren gave a negative snort. Like you said, they were there just to scout you out. I double-checked with my parents. Duke Cho is practically ostracized after Sherlock's idiocy. The news of your promotion probably sealed his isolation, and our retribution will seal his fate, Xing added firmly. The officers walked through the streets without a sound, even as they picked up speed and melted into the shadows with ease. They had honed their stealth against Earth Kingdom rabble-rousers with keen eyes and a penchant for detecting the slightest of tremors. Here, in the heart of the Fire Nation, the officers of the 11th might as well be ghosts of vengeance. They wound up in Duke Cho's estate and settled for observing the over-equipped guards. They look shiny, but they don't look well-trained, Xing commented as he noted how the patrols did not overlap, and how the individual guards spent half their time focused on their comrades in avid conversation instead of keeping their eyes fixed outwards. Too sloppy, Mosey, ever the disciplinarian, agreed. We could get this over with right now. No, Xing immediately replied. The Duke has family, and he might be with them now. Our grudge is with him alone. We wait. Yes, Colonel. The three captains obeyed despite their reluctance. Despite his youth, Xing's plans had always brought the 11th victory, and this time it will bring them vengeance for their fallen comrades. They patiently waited for the hours to melt by, never leaving their shadowed cover until midnight came and the residents of the estate were all asleep. With a gesture from Xing, the four of them moved out in utter silence, slipping through the disappointingly large gap between patrols and climbing over the estate walls before the glow lanterns could reach them. Entering the manor was simple enough. The noble's value of quality meant that the hinges of doors and windows barely made a squeak as they were eased open. It took the quartet far more time to locate their quarry than it did breaking in. But the master bedroom was eventually found, with the Duke and his wife sound asleep within. Xing shared a look with his officers as they loomed over the couple's sleeping forms. Duke Cho was awakened by a discomfort in his mouth and an unfamiliar rocking movement. His eyes shot open with surprise as he realized that he was being carried by two shadowy figures. He made to scream, but then found his mouth gagged with cloth. The noble's panic struggles did little to loosen the grip of his kidnappers, and the cold blade against his neck quickly stopped him from wriggling any further. His kidnappers brought him into the larder, and before he could break free, his hands were bound behind his back, and his legs folded back to have his ankles bound together with his wrists. The figures ignored Duke Cho's muffled panic, though one of them eventually had enough and wrapped a large, meaty hand around his throat and began to slowly squeeze. With a whimper, the Duke took the hint and shut up, and the pressure around his throat was gone. A much smaller figure came into view, taking up Duke Cho's vision. "Ship, save your energy, your grace." It was the voice of a boy. The Duke's panic momentarily got overtaken by confusion. And then he matched the voice to that of the new colonel, just promoted by the Fire Lord the day before. And the noble's struggles renewed with terror-fueled vigor. Or he would, if not for the blade pressing against his throat again. "You should know who I am, Duke Cho. If you do, then you should know why I'm here." The Duke shook his head frantically, muffled sobs leaking out of the cloth stuffing his mouth. The young dragon ignored his incoherent pleas and kept talking. "You should know that I treat the 11th as my family, and its men and women, my brothers and sisters. They took me in and raised me after all." Duke Cho froze in terror as the voice hardened. "And you should know that I am most offended by General Sherlock's time leading my family." The shadowy figure leaned back, letting out a soft exhale. "I care not that he had me lashed. I care not that he carelessly sought glory." Then the shadowed form of Xing leaned in again, and a palpable sense of danger radiated from his obscured face. "I do, however, take offense that the inexperienced idiot belittled Colonel Li Dai's accomplishments. I take offense to his poor treatment of our respected prisoners. And I take the most offense for the farce he called a plan that resulted in the completely wasteful, utterly unnecessary deaths of my brothers and sisters." The boy was snarling by the end of it, and the Duke tried in vain to back away from the waves of rage directed at him. "He's dead now, yes. But the greater idiot that bought the idiot his commission in the first place." The metal on his throat was lifted, only to have its sharpened tip tapping lightly between Duke Cho's brow. "Imagine my offense, imagine my brothers and sisters' offense. That Sherlock's idiocy was inflicted upon us simply because someone paid for his excellent grades in officer school, and subsequently sponsored his command of the 11th? Duke Cho, can you imagine how angry we are at the fool that almost wiped us out simply by buying his brother's way into an undeserving post? And just to cheat their way into some renown, at that." The silhouette of Xing moved back and rose up, ignoring the Duke's muffled noises and desperately shaking head. "Be thankful we are not so wasteful with lives, Cho. Your family will live unharmed. Your mistresses and their children will live unharmed." Other larger figures then filled the terrified Duke's vision, each with a glinting sliver of metal. "You, however, will not live and will be harmed." The gag in Duke Cho's mouth was very effective in muting his anguish throughout the night. They took turns stabbing him, reciting the names of the fallen each time a blade was buried in him. Medicinal poultices were pressed against his wounds to stop him from bleeding out. The shadows were careful to work their way from the least lethal areas in, severing fingers and toes knuckle by knuckle, just to make sure their victim would remain alive long enough that the venerated dead were all avenged. Duke Cho almost lived to see the dawn. The men and women of the 11th had learned not to be wasteful with lives. Sounds of alarm rang as the sun began to peak on the horizon. They found the barely identifiable remains of Duke Cho in the outhouse, his head and plenty of shredded gore filling the bucket. Rumors quickly spread that the Duke's youngest brother had offended the spirits so much with his failure at Tai Plains that they took it out on his immediate family. Xing and his officers were initially suspects, but concrete alibis knocked them out of the list almost immediately. Too many witnesses could attest to the young dragon bantering with his men and women. That the witnesses were all related in some degree to the soldiers of the 11th was overlooked, either by genuine accident or on purpose. Princess Azula ensured the latter occurred if the former did not work. Not that anyone would know, of course. Rin was glad to leave the capital city for the training grounds. The cutthroat politicking spilling out of the place was why she enlisted in the first place. She had to admit that the trip had been worth it though, and not just because of avenging her comrades. Seeing the resources allocated to the 11th Regiment was gratifying, and it was just as good to have all the prestige they'd fought and toiled for finally be put to use. The Fire Lord was pleased enough to ensure priority allocation of all resources to the 11th, which extended to choice selection of recruits. It'd be a grueling couple of months of careful culling to raise the battalions and fully fill in the missing numbers of the 11th Regiment. It was already a pain back when they were campaigning to get the trickle of reinforcements up to standard, with the fires of battle often serving as the best method of forging the lost recruits into proper soldiers. Within the Fire Nation, where there were no Earth Kingdom partisans to scare the inexperienced and overconfident rookies straight, Captain Ren was not looking forward to training up her officers and her rank and file. She consoled herself that at least she would be free from Fire Nation politicking, unlike poor Xing. It was certain that the poor young colonel would have to constantly deal with nobles and bureaucrats while the 11th was rebuilt. Whether he liked it or not, Xing had to establish the same parity of a friendship that every other influential person had while he remained within the heart of the Fire Nation. And with the fame and mystique attached to his name, the poor boy would likely have to deal with snakes and bootlickers by the cartload. Ren snickered as she imagined the number of dinner invitations Xing would be forced to attend. Hopefully Colonel Shou would be still around to look after his young peer. The venerable commander was the most level-headed and reliable of Colonel Li Dai's close circle of friends. He'd make sure Xing didn't get plied with wine or get introduced to bright, pretty daughters. Hopefully, if it was Colonel Dao doing the minding, then Ren could only pray that Xing wouldn't become a young father before the rebuilt 11th even have the chance to deploy. Captain Ren sighed as she imagined all the trouble her young, brilliant adopted brother, screw what Kai thinks, would get dragged into. Shaking off the thoughts, the recently promoted captain got to work in her new office and summoned for her new lieutenants. She'd have a quick look at the new graduates before throwing them into the sparring circle for a few rounds, and then seeing how they handled Xing's wargame. It'd be nice if at least one of them was a cute and well-mannered scion. Lieutenant Koshi. Lieutenant. Koshi didn't realize until now how much he missed that title before his name. He snapped a sharp salute to the smaller figure before him. Colonel Xing. Thank you for accepting this rank, the boy said with a slight frown on his face. I know you're slated for captaincy, but considering the circumstances. Koshi bowed respectfully, fist in palm. It is no bother, Colonel. I am more than happy to serve once more as an honor guard. He knew his limits. Leadership was not something Koshi aspired to anyway, and there was plenty of prestige still to be had as a colonel's bodyguard. The colonel nodded gratefully. Thank you. My life is in your hands, Lieutenant. The honor is mine, Colonel. And it was true. Like everyone else, Koshi respected young Xing for all that he'd done for the 11th. The orphan had quickly been more than just a regimental mascot after being recovered from the ruined colony, and had fearlessly saved plenty of soldiers in the heat of battles, Koshi's included. General Li Dai's adoption of his strategies and tactics against the Earth Kingdom marauders had significantly slowed the attrition suffered by the 11th and earned the regiment plenty of renown. Koshi gritted his teeth as he remembered his shameful inaction as the bastard Shirluo had Xing whipped for voicing his objection to the mistreatment of the prisoners. The spineless general probably could not stand the humiliation from having his delusional battle plans questioned and needed a reason to take it out on Xing. The captains and lieutenants had protested to no avail, but Koshi should have tried to stop them, like Rin did. He'd been already demoted. He had far less to lose than Rin. It was only Colonel Dao's intervention that Xing still had some skin left on his shredded back. I will not fail you again. Xing's head tilted to one side as he blinked in confusion. You're an exemplary warrior, Koshi. When have you failed me? I'm pretty sure there's no bad blood between us. Koshi flushed as cowardice kept him from voicing his guilt. The colonel dismissed the topic with a wave of his hand. We can worry about it later. For now, though, I need you to rebuild the honor guard. Having only you and Yen would overwork the two of you to death. Koshi straightened, and then shamefully latched onto the new topic. I understand, Colonel. I'll leave the recruitment up to you. The lieutenant saluted again, more determined this time. Yes, Colonel. Are there any requirements you wish from them? Since honor guards reflected the prestige of their charges, it was not uncommon for generals and colonels to be selective in certain traits, like Colonel Yashin favoring warcleaver specialists, or Colonel Dao's bodyguards consisting completely of men capable of flipping a log end over end at least 2 yards away. No, you're free to pick who you deem fitting. Oh, the boy paused for a second, and Koshi saw from the smirk that twitched at the edge of his lips that an unreasonable request was coming. Don't recruit anyone named Han just yet. Koshi couldn't help himself. Colonel, Xing shook his head, stifling a chuckle as he waved the question off. It's a pet project, you can say, remembering previous projects. Koshi wisely left it at that and left the colonel's office to immediately start on his task. He'll have to ask Yen and the captains for suggestions. No doubt it'll be a problem of culling all the eager volunteers once the positions were made known. There was even a non-zero chance that he'd have to make sure Run and Kai don't find a way to demote themselves, just for a chance to be closer to their little brother. Ah, Colonel Xing. The boy in question bowed deeply and offered a sharp salute as he stopped about 10 paces away. Princess Azula. He dropped the salute and straightened up, but his gaze was lowered, as was right for his station. Azula regarded the teen colonel in silence for a moment, frowning as she tried to decipher the interesting image he presented to her. The colonel was dressed in a freshly pressed set of civilian's clothes, that of a well-to-do, but not wealthy lowborn. Despite his age, he looked far more battle-hardened than some of the graying commanders that advised her father. He was tense and alert despite the blank gaze he offered, but not afraid or nervous. Interesting indeed. Finally, the princess let out a lopsided grin. It's good to see you've answered my summons so promptly, Colonel. Xing gave a curt nod, not rude, but not too respectful either. It would be disrespectful of me to do otherwise, Princess. He masked his annoyance well, but it showed nonetheless. Yet his answer was faultless. Intriguing. Time to stoke the flames then. Azula fought off the urge to grin. Let me be frank, Colonel. I've summoned you because I am puzzled. You see, a few nights ago, Duke Cho was found horribly dead in his estate. Xing twitched so faintly at the mention of the Duke's name. Practically impossible to notice if one didn't look for it. And while many are claiming it to be the work of angered spirits, I've heard whispers telling me otherwise. The girl tapped at her lips thoughtfully with one finger, carefully pacing her words. You see, I've been told that it's not the spirits who were angered, but several officers from a regiment that Duke Cho had offended. Something to do with securing his brother a general's commission for that particular regiment. Xing was almost utterly unmoving. There were slightly more noticeable twitches on his fingers, and the very slight shift of his feet, as if he was ready to pounce. His gaze was still directed to the air in front of him, but the sharp anger, not panic, that exuded from him was palpable. Azula allowed herself to smirk a bit. Well, Colonel, do you have any thoughts on that matter? As you are frank, Princess, please allow me to do so as well. Azula gave a gracious nod of her head, and she fought the urge to reel back as Xing's gaze rose to meet hers. His disgust, caged as it was intense. I would like to know the point of what your highness is getting at. Still respectful, if just barely. Despite his poor manners, Azula was getting genuinely impressed with Xing, especially when compared to her weakling brother. Relax, Colonel. I am not here to threaten or punish you. More credit to him, he did not relax at all. In fact, I wish to applaud your actions. Still tense. You uprooted a weakness within my father's kingdom, and thanks to your message, the spineless nobles will know better than to weaken our forces with their corruption. Your punishment of Duke Cho's failure will remain a secret, as much as I would like to publicly reward you for that service. The anger in the colonel subsided into simmering embers, and he managed a stiff nod before lowering his gaze once more. I am grateful for your praise, Princess. It's no matter, Azula replied breezily, waving a hand with equal casualness. It's good to see that there are loyal and competent leaders serving the Fire Nation. Such talent should not be wasted on courtly intrigues, am I right? Colonel Xing did not reply, so she arched an eyebrow as she continued. You know, by now I'm sure most men would be simpering out of gratitude or bursting with outrage. Yet you're still standing there, all quiet and angry. I apologize for disappointing your expectations, Princess, he said, the words forced through gritted teeth. Oh, you're far from a disappointment. Xing, may I call you Xing? She didn't wait for an answer. I find your control and achievements to be impressive indeed. Impressive enough that I might offer you my official support. This finally got Xing to raise an eyebrow. Might, Princess? Azula grinned again. I will first need to confirm for myself that you are truly as competent as they say. You will not mind a brief spar, would you? Xing seemed to pause in thought, before he let out a resigned sigh. I would have to admit that I will be a poor choice of a sparring partner, Your Highness. Oh, that was actually surprising. Azula folded her arms in front of her as she regarded him curiously. She'd expected the boy to be more than happy to vent some of his outrage. The colonel bowed again, this time to feign apology. I am just an orphan unofficially adopted by the regiment that now I have the honor of leading. The 11th were always diligent in their duties that my firebending training is limited to the most pragmatic uses. I learned mostly from combat against the Earth Kingdom armies. My bending will undoubtedly be unsightly and unsafe for formal sparring. Is that so? Now it was Azula's turn to quirk up an eyebrow. Unsafe firebending? She definitely wanted to see that. Then it is fortunate that I am competent enough for both of us, Xing, she proclaimed confidently, and then moved past him towards the door. Come, we shall use the private training grounds. Azula grinned to herself as she felt Xing's annoyance radiate for a moment before he reluctantly followed along. Unsafe firebending? Would it be worse compared to Zuko's weak bending? Azula would find out, and she would no doubt prove her superiority to this promising officer. The princess frowned as she considered that she might have to come up with a suitably gracious speech. Can't have the young colonel too upset with her if she wanted him to work for her. Surely you can do better than that, Azula drawled, her tone thick with disappointment as she dusted some loose dirt off her attire. At least he was honest about being a poor sparring partner. The test of character was disappointing, very disappointing indeed. Even the palace guards watching them at a distance were muttering their disapproval. Xing's movements were swift but stiff, greatly lacking in the fluidity required to channel and focus his chi. His punches and kicks were half-hearted and indecisive, creating pitiful gouts of flame that wouldn't even melt a candle. She barely needed to block or avoid most of his sad attempts at an offensive. The boy was clearly holding back on some misguided attempt to not harm her. Are you going to bother trying? Azula asked right before she lunged into a flurry of punches and whirling kicks, lashing out with tongues of flame. Maybe with enough pressure, she could break Xing from his reticence. The colonel, however, dodged her strikes with surprising ease, his gaze never leaving the princess as he sidestepped and whirled aside just enough to avoid the attacks. Azula allowed a small scowl to grace her features as she continued her attack, leaping to close the distance and launching a series of kicks midair that sent a barrage of fiery bolts raining down on Xing. He weaved through the hail of fire effortlessly, and as the princess descended with an axe kick aimed for his head, Xing opted to step back and avoid the flurry of fire punches instead of blocking and stopping the offensive momentum as standard convention dictated. If nothing else, Xing was good at not getting hit. Was he really that bad a firebender that he had to resort to dodging? Or was the boy merely toying with her? The fact that she even considered the latter thought offended Azula. You are starting to annoy me, Colonel, she hissed. I'm starting to think that all the tales about your exploits are just mirages. They are greatly exaggerated, Xing replied with an infuriating nod, eyes just low enough to not meet hers. Did he really not care about his prestige? If you truly are this incompetent, maybe I should have my father rethink your promotion. Ah, a twitch in the corner of his eye. Azula grinned as she found his weakness. Perhaps I should suggest another appointment for the 11th Regiment. Another promising noble who could use the glory, HM. Xing's body stiffened, and there was a flash of fury in his eyes. Good. Come then, Colonel. If you wish to keep your command, prove to me that you are worthy of it. She settled into a combat stance, grinning with anticipation. Fight me. I promise, you don't have to beat me. It wouldn't be fair to set an impossible challenge, after all. The boy's stare blazed for a second, and she noticed how his eyes then glazed over with hostility. As you wish, Princess, he said flatly while bowing deeply. I deeply apologize in advance for the offense I will commit. With that, he adopted a crouched, almost hunched stance. Azula was about to laugh at the proclamation when her instincts screamed at her to leap aside. She did so just as Xing suddenly closed the distance, fists leading the way. Azula's eyes were wide as she watched the punches fill the space where her head used to be. Her mouth gaped open in further surprise as a jet of blinding white flames then burst out from them. Before she could comprehend what she just avoided, Azula quickly rolled away as a small orb of the same fire blasted out a small crater on the ground she once occupied. Pure instincts kept her moving as Xing's leg came down and left a small smoldering crater upon contacting the ground. She made enough distance to safely stand, but had to immediately twist painfully to one side to avoid another punch aimed for her head. The burst of fire erupting from the strike caused some of the guards behind her to shout out. Whether in panic or otherwise, she was too busy to care. Azula tried to retaliate with a fiery strike of her own, sending a knee up to his guts. Xing shifted aside as she expected, but her ensuing elbow strike was batted aside with a backhand that trailed a curtain of fire, which forced the princess to wince and backpedal away. She wanted to growl her annoyance, but Xing did not give her that luxury. Without hesitation, the colonel charged through the dissipating flames, striking and kicking in a pattern that Azula was completely unfamiliar with. The speed at which he delivered his attacks, along with the recent memory of his fiery follow-up, made blocking a risky prospect, so she had to desperately dance aside or deflect the blows as they came. For all his poor posture, Xing was faster than many of her mentors. He also kept close to Azula, never letting up in his offense and never giving her the space and the chance to get into the proper stance to deliver a decisive counterattack. It didn't help that he kept aiming at her neck and face with fists and knife hands, while his legs swept and whipped about in an attempt to trip and knock her over. She tried batting aside a jab aimed for the throat, and with the same arm sent an elbow into his face. Xing responded by quickly delivering a quick jab into her now exposed side. It forced her to abort her attack and instead send the elbow down to intercept the strike, landing a sharp blow onto his wrist. But the awkward stance she was forced into put her back in the defensive again, and Xing didn't seem to register the damage that was supposed to be inflicted to his hand. Instead, he kept a blank stare locked onto her, and Azula noticed how he never spun about or moved in any way that might break his vision. Not that the close proximity allowed him to do anything fancy to begin with. Still, the unrelenting gaze was genuinely unnerving. Azula's final attempt at breaking Xing's momentum was a bold and desperate lunge forwards, using the palm and elbow of one arm to push aside his arms and make way for a swift punch into his throat. However, Xing deftly shifted out of the attempt at deflection, and his hand grabbed tightly onto her blocking wrist to yank her towards him just as he lowered his head. A burst of fire from her feet propelled her away from the waiting headbutt, but he still held onto her arm, and the jarring imbalance from the desperate move allowed him to shift his weight and throw her groundward. Azula's fall was arrested by strong hands grabbing her shoulders, but that only brought her face inches from his. Azula remembered the nickname the colonel had earned in the 11th, and saw the wisps of smoke exiting his widening maw as he continued to glare death at her. This was the end, she thought. She wanted to cry out her denial, her defiance at the inevitable. But instead Azula found herself frozen and staring in horror as Xing opened his mouth fully. And an intense blast of heat washed across the left side of her face, coupled with a deafening roar. And then it was gone, leaving relieving coolness to soak across her warmed skin. The princess and the colonel stared at each other, the former in incomprehensible shock, while the latter was starting to lose his combat daze. Colonel Xing stepped back, pulling Azula up to her feet in the process. The fury and raw violence in his eyes melted away, and he backed away further before bowing and saluting her. "I hope the demonstration is to your satisfaction, Princess." Azula blinked at his sudden change in demeanor, and then glanced around her. A small, charred hole in the ground smoldered next to where her head would have been just now. The rest of the training grounds were peppered with small craters, a fate shared by parts of the stone walls around it. Some of the palace guards were cowering behind blasted cover, with the rush from certain death still thick in her veins. The Fire Nation princess stared at the colonel with his lowered gaze. He had not declared his victory. There was no triumphant mockery from him, no smirk of superiority. The boy was back to his stoic expression again. The lowborn orphan wasn't even showing signs of exertion, though Azula was still too shaken to take offense at that insult. Yes, she took a steadying breath full of smoke and burnt soil, and then forced herself to don the mask of royal aloofness. "Yes, that will be sufficient, Colonel." She paused for a few seconds, waiting in vain for any reply before continuing. "You are clearly more than capable of leading the 11th Regiment. Thank you for your praise, Your Highness." Try as she might, Azula found no trace of sarcasm in his voice. If anything, he was annoyed. Why was he annoyed? Quickly recovering from her surprise, Azula cleared her throat and regained some of her usual composure. Indeed, as I promised, the 11th Regiment will have my royal patronage. I will ensure that the needs of your command are not disgracefully overlooked again like before. Xing saluted, still as infuriatingly sharp as ever. My men and women will be most elated to hear of your highness' generosity. I thank you on their behalf, Princess. Yes, yes, Azula said with forced offhandedness, waving him off. I'll not hold you any longer. Return to your task, and see to it that your regiment does not disappoint me, Colonel. By your leave then, Princess. With that, he was gone, and Azula watched as the boy left her sight before she hurried off to her room, the heat from the side of her face quickly growing to encapsulate the other half. This Xing was a troubling puzzle. What in the world was his fire bending? Surely it couldn't be something just learned from combat? And if his fire bending was so devastating, why was he insistent about hiding it? Was there something else to it that he didn't want to draw attention to? Why was he annoyed at his obvious victory? Was he worried about causing offense? Did he think her to be so petty? Sure, she might be on occasion, but that's besides the point. And why was it that her blood still raced and her heart still pounded even after the match was over? It was clearly not insult or anger Azula was feeling, though that revelation was surprising in itself. There was something about that display of ruthlessness that was, if it was not frustrating, then what? With the sparring over, one of the two figures in the upper floors finally spoke. What do you think, General Bujing? The calculative general nodded thoughtfully. Colonel Xing seems to be as impressive as the tales make him out to be, Your Majesty. While inelegant, it's clear enough that his method of fighting is meant to exploit the Earthbender's defensive stances. Only the inherent swiftness of firebending kept the princess from any serious harm. Despite the implied danger to royalty, Bujing smiled. I can see why the Earth Kingdom has such a high bounty on the young dragon. Do his men share his aptitude for firebending? Bujing shook his head slowly. So far as I know, the firebenders of the 11th show praiseworthy skill in battle, but nothing like the flames of the colonel. The High General frowned in thought. Come to think of it, none of the other forces we've questioned mentioned anything about the white flames. Perhaps it's meant to be kept secret. Fire Lord Ozai hummed in thought before coming to a decision. As Colonel Xing shows great talent, we shall not squander it. Have the 11th Regiment be reassigned from resistance suppression. They have a reputation of breaking through stubborn Earthbender formations. Utilize that. I will adjust our plans accordingly, Fire Lord. The fools who had allowed for the 11th Regiment's relegation and deterioration. See to it that they are punished for their corruption. General Bujing smiled widely. I know just the front that could use such cowards, Your Majesty. The Fire Lord watched as his daughter stormed off with a bit of a limp, and another thought occurred to him. Tell me honestly, General, how much would the Fire Nation stand to gain if we adopted this orphan? Or tie this commoner colonel to the royal family by other means? Assuming he proves his worth, of course. Kai couldn't help speaking out when Xing entered the meeting. Almost late for once. You all right, Xing? You look pissed. More frankly, it looked like he was coming down after losing control and slaughtering Earth Kingdom levies again. The colonel shook his head even as he rubbed at his wrist. Nothing to concern yourself, Captain. Rin threw a dirty grin. How did your meeting with the princess go? Kai's head snapped to the captain, and then back to Xing with trepidation. Princess? The boy waved off, frowning a bit petulantly as he took his place at the head of the table, but did not sit. It's nothing. Can we get on with the meeting? Of course, Rin wouldn't leave it at that. Did you get rejected, Colonel? Rin, Xing said in his quit the dragon mushit voice, and thankfully the captain shut up. Now, how is the regiment? Mosey, said Lieutenant Colonel, gave a single nod. Supplies are at ideal levels. We're still weeding out prospective recruits. There's a lot of work required to bring them up to our standards, but we should still have enough time. Even the extra material request. Mosey rolled his eyes. Yes, even your added requests. Great, thanks. It was one of the few times Kai saw Xing smile brightly like a boy his age should. Unfortunately, the smile didn't last too long as he returned to his usual stony mask. Any issues with the new officers? He asked, looking around to the new captains. Needed to knock some sense into them, but they should be all right, Ren reported seriously. I'm putting them through the same drills as the recruits. Weikong, Rufin and Ping nodded to show their shared sentiment. Me too. The same. Yeah, same here. Xing finally sat down in his seat, and Kai and the others pretended not to notice the colonel wincing. He would need a bit more healing before his back was fully healed. Huh, and here I was expecting them to throw us more crappy newbies. The officers grinned and chuckled. After all the news the other colonels spread about you, I think even the most petty nobles would know better than to continue their grudge against Colonel Li Dai. True. Xing stared into the air for a moment before shaking his head. Anyway, I've got good and bad news. Ren's face broke into a cheeky smirk again. Something to do with the princess? The colonel let out a suffering sigh before he replied. Yes, unfortunately. Princess Azula will be personally investing her royal patronage on the regiment. We can hopefully expect that the 11th will not have any logistical issues for the foreseeable future. But that means we might also have to act on her interests when she asks for it. Kai was sure all eyes were fixed on Xing, and everyone's jaws had dropped just like his. How'd he secure royal patronage? Did you kiss her or something? To his horror, Kai realized it wasn't Ren that spouted the words, but himself. Damn it, he was supposed to be the dependable big brother. No, Xing replied, giving no time for the captain to regret his slip. We sparred. She seemed impressed enough. Scared. He meant to say scared, Kai realized. And the 11th got its patronage. Mosey huffed incredulously, though like the other officers, he too caught the underlying implication. When you put it like that, you make it sound so easy. I thought you were trying to avoid further attention. I was, the boy half whined. But she's a princess, and it'd be worse if I refused her demands. Kai found himself nodding with some of the others. Going against the wishes of the Fire Lord or his family would be tantamount to suicide, no matter how brilliant you thought you were. Mosey joined in with the nodding. So when do I break the news? Once we get the official paperwork. Do we have to make a big ceremony out of it? It'd be expected, Ping answered, earning another drawn-out sigh from Xing. Well, at the very least, you've done Colonel Li Dai proud, Kai offered, and at that the colonel's annoyance seemed to soften significantly. Yeah, I guess so. We'll do it for him then. There were resolute nods all around the meeting table, and then they moved on to the next topic. So, what's the political situation in the capital like? Whose toes can we afford to step on once we go back out? A servant led the curious guest into the main hall, and Prince Iroh found himself looking at a boy Zuko's age who was well-dressed and a bit too stiffly upright. The retired general immediately realized with sorrow that the boy was a soldier. Was he a conscript or hopefully just a messenger? Welcome, boy. What can I do for you? The boy snapped a bow and a sharp salute, and Iroh hit a wince. Definitely not a messenger boy. But he didn't recall his brother having to scrape the barrel for recruits. Prince Iroh, it is an honor to meet you. I am Colonel Xing of the 11th Regiment. The 11th? Iroh's eyes widened a bit as he remembered. You are Li Dai's grandson. Even with his lowered face, it was clear that the boy was smiling. I am glad that he considers me so highly. Xing rose up from his bow. I am sorry to impinge on your time, but I have come to deliver the late colonel's wishes to you. Iroh watched as the much too young colonel retrieved a small silken pouch from his belt and reverentially offered it to him. He glanced at the container briefly, and then turned his attention to Xing. Do you know what's in it? I've seen the contents, but I've not been told of their significance. For a moment, Iroh thought he detected a half-truth, but he let it pass. He received the silk package with care and untied it to have a peek within. There was a bronze badge, one that commemorated their friendly rivalry. Also within were a few gold pieces. Iroh smiled softly as he remembered his thrifty friend's little debt to him, now repaid. His smile faded as he found just hidden under the pile of gold a small object. Iroh reached in to retrieve it with his index and middle fingers. Li Dai, he muttered as he stared at the white lotus tile, and then glanced up at Xing, who was doing a good job of not paying attention to him. Dropping the tile back in the sack and then putting it aside, Iroh's smile returned as he regarded his friend's protege. Come, have a seat. I'll call for some tea. Xing hesitated for a second before nodding, and then joined the prince by a small table. He seemed a bit apprehensive in his steps, as if he was worried about causing undue offense. Peculiar, but considering that this Xing was supposed to be a rescued colonist, perhaps he was being overly worried about noble etiquette. We've not had the chance to communicate much while he was on campaign, but Li Dai has told me many great things about you, Iroh said, trying to ease the boy. The tea arrived, but neither made a move for it. Xing's smile was sad, one that clearly showed his attachment to the old colonel. He and his regiment took me in. I owe him a great deal. And now you've taken up his mantle, the prince replied without judgment. I've heard some of the tragedy that befell your regiment. I'm sure Li Dai would be proud of all you've accomplished to keep his command. For a moment, a fathomless fury flashed through Xing's eyes. We lost many good men and women to the petty games of some nobles, he stated bluntly. All I've managed to do was salvage just enough to not disgrace his legacy. This time Iroh did cringe, remembering Li Dai's troubles. He was the leader of the dwindling faction of so-called soft leaders, whose existence Iroh once found contemptuous right up until Boss Xing say. Yet his achievements on the front lines ensured that they remained beyond most direct politicking, which was why someone, or someones, eventually resorted to slowly redirecting supplies from Li Dai's 11th Regiment in the hopes of bleeding him to a failure. According to the communications he received before Li Dai passed, Xing was the reason the 11th lasted as long as they did. The way Li Dai praised his grandson at times made Iroh think that the old coot had forgotten about his own family back home. Family that had lost much. That sobering thought brought out a sigh from the aging prince. It is partially my fault, he muttered sadly. I'd been a bit too blind in my ambitions, back when I was crowned prince. Iroh regretfully told the boy who now wore a stoic mask and did not meet his gaze. It was a mistake to make light of his ideals, and not intervene when his rivals conspired against him. Xing gulped silently before he replied. Colonel Li Dai did not begrudge you that. You are his friend. He has no ill will towards you, or any of those who wronged him. Iroh did not miss the wording, and gazed at the boy wearily. But you do, he asked gently. The colonel's shoulders rose up in his seat as he drew in a breath, and then slumped as he exhaled softly. I am trying not to, as he wished me to. Heavy silence fell as Iroh studied the boy. Finally he said, Li Dai would be proud of you. He bent over in a deep bow. And I thank you for making the effort, though I understand if you still harbor resentment for my inaction. I know that words alone would never be enough. Xing shook his head before rising to his feet. I will get over it. To do otherwise would be petty of me. It was hard not to admire the boy. So much different in temperament to the soft Li Dai. Yet he still tried to keep to his mentor's ideals. Iroh looked at the conflicted boy who was about to leave, and decided to try to make amends for indirect harm he'd caused his late friend and his young successor. Must you leave so soon? He ventured. The tea is still warm. Perhaps you can tell me more of Li Dai's exploits. Our exchanges were infrequent. On seeing Xing wavering, Iroh threw in, I'll trade you stories of his time as my senior. Did you know he almost made my brother laugh one time? That seemed to have done the trick, as the boy gave him a faint smile. I would like that. I thank you for your time, Prince Iroh. Please, I don't have much else to do anyway. Come, try the tea while it's still warm. It's a new blend. They soon exchanged tales about old Li Dai, and all the while Iroh listened attentively to the young Xing. Eventually, he decided to trust his friend's judgment and posed the question. By the way, did Li Dai ever teach you Pai Shou? With the colonel away on various frustratingly necessary social visits, and Mosey busy with logistics, Rin ended up in a bitching group with her fellow captains during their lunch break. Outside, the lieutenants were overseeing the battered intake, making sure that the prospective recruits were still breathing. These city slickers, she moaned out as she leaned back on her seat's back legs. Weikong made a harsh noise, feigning a spit. Too soft, too ambitious, too stupid. Useless bastards. Tell me about it, Rin replied. It's taking so much time getting them to learn our spear drills. Kai gave a disgruntled nod, scowling all the while. And their squad tactics. I swear it's safer to separate our vets from the newbies, or either the former's going to murder the latter, or the latter's going to get the former killed. Ping gave a sad chuckle after gulping down her bowl of tea. And we haven't gotten to night training yet. That earned a collective groan from the captains. The prospect of getting Fire Nation soldiers to operate and fight in the 11th's preferred methods were arduous indeed. Who wants to bet that they'll be whining about setting camp in the dark? Weikong offered with a weak grin. Ruffin waved it off. No bet. The few recruits we had to train back then were already struggling, and they were from the colonies. This spoiled bunch would be worse. Weikong snickered. What about the number of times it'll take before they know how to correctly form up in the dark? Piss off, Weikong, Rin sighed. Well, it could be worse, Kai said, drawing everyone's curious attention. We could be doing Koshi's work. Rin snorted at that. The lucky pricks who sought the prestigious job of honor guard were being pushed hard by the lieutenant, who seemed determined to create bodyguards that could stand and bounce off earthbender rocks. Rin could understand why, though. Nobody in the regiment would stand to see Xing being covered in arrows and earthen spikes ever again if they could help it. Koshi particularly seemed to have taken that sentiment to heart, mostly because it was his life Xing had saved during Tai Plains. How the wannabes were still in one piece was a mystery to everyone. True that, Ping voiced and then giggled. Or you could be in the Han unit. More groans rose up at the mention of Xing's pet project. He definitely had some whimsical reason to have a unit comprised only of soldiers named Han. But like many other acts of whimsy, nobody else will likely ever understand the colonel's inside joke. Not that they were given any leniency in their training. If anything, Xing's personal involvement might see half the unit drop out. For their sakes, Rin hoped the Han recruits all abandoned their prestigious posting before the colonel started training them. Speaking of the colonel, the captains perked up as they heard ever-urgent strides of their colonel approaching. True enough, the door to the officers' mess hall opened and Xing appeared. He looked a little tired, but also a little less tense. Rin rose up at the same time as Kai, and both raced to be the first. The bastard tossed his tea bowl at her face, but Rin ducked without breaking her stride. In retaliation, the woman hurled her tea bowl straight at his ankles, though Kai was skilled enough to avoid it. It boiled down to speed and determination then, but unfortunately for both of them, Xing raised a hand and threw a disapproving frown at both captains before they could tackle him. No, and stop breaking public property. They skidded to a halt. Just an arm's length from Xing. Ren took a glance at the position of their toes. Hers were definitely closer to Xing. She threw a quick smirk of triumph at a glowering Kai before the colonel spoke up again. You two, clean up your mess before the break's over. Yes, Colonel, they both replied laconically. Xing walked towards a free chair, Kai's spot before the race, much to Ren's chagrin, and sat in it, sighing aloud as he stared up at the ceiling. Long day with the nobles? Ruffin guessed. No, just had a friendly visit with Prince Iroh. Oh, every captain replied at once. Rin slowly walked over, ready to offer a comforting hug. How was it? I didn't hit him. Small smiles broke out amongst the officers. That's good, Kai said. Colonel Li Dai would approve. It's hard to dislike him, Xing said. And they were really friends. The boy's gaze finally left the ceiling and turned to the captains. He also offered some useful contacts. A few smiths in Fire Fountain City, some merchants and dockmasters throughout the kingdom. Well, it's good to know we have some backup to our supplies, Rin offered as she walked behind Xing and draped her arms around his neck reassuringly. You did good, Xing. Yeah. Xing drawled before he suddenly took on a more uncertain pose. Something wrong? Ren asked as she gently rested her chin on his head. She saw him fiddle with something in his belt's pouch. A gift of apology from the Dragon of the West? Not really, but did any of you know that Colonel Li Dai was good at Pai Shou? The captains exchanged puzzled glances before they shook their heads. I'll have to ask Mosey and Koshi, but I'm sure I never saw him with a set or even play with the prisoners, Kai answered. Why do you ask? Rin could feel the boy frown from the way his head shifted under her chin. It's nothing important. According to Prince Iroh, he and the colonel were avid players long ago. They tried playing again by exchanging messages. How good was the colonel? Ruffin asked, breaking the silence before it could settle awkwardly. Rin could hear her little brother's smile as he nodded and replied. Quite good. Supposedly the colonel taught the prince a few things. Life as a prisoner of war wasn't too bad. If you were captured by the 11th Regiment, anyway. Colonel Li Dai was known for his honorable conduct, and his hospitality was nothing to complain about. It was only after the prisoners had been handed over to other Fire Nation forces that most of the escapees who returned to tell the tale began their complaints. And things got better when the brat joined the regiment. General Yama was lucky enough to be captured during the last few years of Li Dai's command. The old warrior was as every bit a gentleman and a stark contrast to many of his younger and brash peers. It almost felt at times that the imprisonment was more like a forced vacation away from Boss Xing politics. They ate the same food as the Fire Nation soldiers. Their prisoners' tents were spacious with decent bedding. There was no torture and interrogation, and Li Dai rarely had the prisoners bound too tightly. Even as the regiment's conditions deteriorated from attrition, The old man did not compromise on his treatment of prisoners. Much as Yama loathed to admit it, the boy also made confined life more tolerable. Whether they liked it or not, the boy often ate with them, initially to prove that the food was not compromised in any way, and always asked if they had any needs, other than freedom, that their captors could attend to. He helped write and then pass along messages back home, made sure their pot of tea was never empty, and served as the friendlier face for the newer prisoners to get accustomed to. The other imprisoned officers warmed up to Xing quickly, seeing in the brat their own children. Many half-seriously offered the brat a place in their household should he ever surrender to them in the future. It took Yama a bit longer to tolerate his presence, though. The sting to his pride took a long while to fade. But as prisoners came and went, the Earth Kingdom general soon became the longest-staying guest of the 11th Regiment and eventually got accustomed to the boy. Politics kept his name from being requested during prisoner exchanges, and stubborn pride kept him from accepting Li Dai and Xing's offer to be sent back home. The pissant strategists back home clearly sought to kill two birds with one stone by leaving him to the mercies of the Fire Nation. They'd quietly celebrate his demise, and at the same make a martyr out of him to drum up more support. Fortunately for the stocky general, the old man and his annoying apprentice were happy to keep their prisoners hale. Little wonder then that few Earth Kingdom and Water Tribe captives thought of escaping, and none who had stayed for longer than a month had actually bothered trying. Speaking of annoying, a knock came to the wooden door to the prisoners' barracks. "General Yama?" "Elder Kylan." Yama huffed as he turned away from the board before him to shout at the closed door. "Go away, brat. I'm in the middle of beating this water hag's ass." His opponent cheerily called out right after him. "Come in, lad. You're just in time to watch Rock for Brains get buried." Again, as Yama grumbled, the brat stepped in with a respectful bow before walking over to the pie show board. "Not a word, brat," the general preemptively said as he felt the boy's judging gaze. "But you shut it," Yama interrupted and stared back at the board, just in time to see Kylan place a dragon tile to effectively capture Yama's flower tiles. And just like that, an encirclement was created that counted down the general's remaining moves. Another sharp glance warned the brat to stay silent, and Yama stared hard at the board. And he stared some more before finally sighing heavily. "Stupid Southern River rules." The wrinkled waterbender smirked, folding her arms smugly. "It was your idea to play it. Not my fault you're as bad at it as you are with the garden cage variant, or the silver diamond one, or practically any form of pie show." Harumphing, Yama rose up and turned to the boy. "So, what are you here for, brat?" The boy gave an amused smile. "You could have won just now in 2 moves, you know that, right?" He reached down to pick up a blue lotus and a jasmine, and placed both tiles to decisively seize Kylan's territory. "Shit," Yama breathed out half-heartedly. Stupid kid showed him up again. "Anyway, I'm here for the healing." Any remaining bluster left Yama as he remembered what Xing had been through. Relaxing the sudden clenching of his fist, the general gave a nod and headed out. "I'll be in the yard." He didn't want to see the results of his defiance. Leaving the waterbender to her repairs, the general found himself sulking as he always did when he recalled the utterly horrific events back then. He tried to channel the emotions through his earthbending, ignoring the other prisoners and the guards of the 11th that stood guard outside the newly built internment facility not too far from the Fire Nation's capital. They paid him no mind as he stomped on the ground to will up a column of earth. A downwards chop with one hand split the column in 2, and Yama began using one half to batter at the other. The quick destruction of the crumbling earth columns was only a little satisfying. Imagining the bastard Sherlow's punchable face ate at his nerves. As ever, the thought of that brainless fool inevitably brought Yama's thoughts back to that night. As the sole Earth Kingdom general, he'd been tied to a post and threatened with torture. Sherluo didn't care that Yama had been stuck with the 11th for 4 years already, and that any information he had was clearly going to be out of date at best. Stupid prick was clearly wanting to flex his impotent authority. Yama only offered curses, of course. The spineless general was about to call for the first of his soldiers to practice their fire-bending on him when Xing desperately tried to put a stop to it. "He won't have anything useful," the boy desperately cried out. "And he's a valuable prisoner." Yama remembered the bastard's sneer right as he callously backhanded Xing. "Enough. I've had it with your insolent disruption." The veterans of the 11th twitched and made to move, but they were badly outnumbered by the fresh reinforcements Shirluo had brought with him. Xing still tried to protest, but that only riled the feckless general to a breaking point. "I said enough, you petulant child. You, tie him to the other post, that one." Yama realized too late that that was the point. The boy had purposely redirected the general's wrath. Chaos erupted in the camp as Captain Kai, Lieutenant Run, and the others protested and tried to reach Xing, but the conflicted newcomers were ultimately obedient to Shirluo's orders. "Back away, you louts." Clearly, discipline needs to be reintroduced in this regiment. The way he sniffed after that was just asking for a stone spiked through the face. "I'll see to the rest of you after my victory." Yama remembered the boy's stony features as he was tied to the post. Shirluo had one of his bodyguards bring out a standard military flogger. "The boy wants to be part of the army. I'll treat him like he's in the army." 40 lashes, Budo. The veterans of the 11th cried out and fought harder, and Kylan and the other prisoners were screaming down curses as well. Kai and Run were actually held back from fire-bending against their fellows. Some of the others interrupted from drawing their daggers. Yama felt sick at seeing the boy accept his fate. To his eternal shame, Yama only kept silent as he watched the brute of a bodyguard unfurl the whip to begin the lashes. The first wet crack of hide on flesh drowned out all other noises. Xing grimaced but didn't give voice to his pain. Rin broke through right as the second lash landed, but Shirluo's bodyguards tackled her to the ground. Yama saw Xing going pale as blood began to drip onto the ground below him. He was shuddering from the pain, closed eyes and bruised cheeks wet with tears. His legs gave way by the 8th lash, leaving him almost dangling from the post. But even as the 12th lash tore into his back, the boy fought to deny Shirluo the satisfaction of so much as a groan. Only the loud appearance of Colonel Dao and his fully armed retinue stopped the 13th strike. "What is going on here?" the large man exclaimed more than asked, his broadsword already in hand as he glared at Shirluo. True to his spineless nature, the spineless coward actually wilted at the belligerence from a lower-ranking commander. "I was just about to interrogate the prisoner," called Colonel. But the b-boy, the boy dash, shut it. Dao was fuming, and as much as Yama disliked the lummox, he was glad to see the Fire Nation commander's wrath unleashed. "Let them go. Now." But the prisoner, the Fire Lord charged the 11th to keep? Dao roared back, and Shirluo paled and shrunk back further. The prisoner whose good health was royally decreed a strategic necessity? The prisoner you were about to harm? What of it? The farce of a general let out a whimper of an order, and Yama was untied and sent back to join the other glowering prisoners. He glanced back just in time to see Lieutenant Ren running to a bloody pile that was Xing, wailing his name. Dao's men dispersed the regiment, and Yama didn't know what happened after, save that there was a lot of shouting outside, and the colonel of the 4th Regiment entered the prisoner's tent with Xing in his arms, immediately turning his gaze to the Water Tribe prisoners. It was the only time Yama had heard the boisterous warlord whisper, "Waterbenders, can I leave him in your care?" It took Kylan and 2 other waterbender healers the whole night to keep the boy from expiring. Yama would forever remember the boy's shredded back, ruined to the point where his spine and the back of his ribs could be seen poking out at places. That Xing awoke the next morning was a minor miracle in itself. "Oi, General!" A familiar voice snapped him out of his dark reminiscing, and General Yama of the Earth Kingdom found himself under the shadow of a towering pile of dirt, with deep pits on either side of him. Captain Rin gave him an amused look as she strode up to him. "Are you trying to dig your way back home, or build a mountain high enough to leap over the sea?" Annoyed at his own distracted state, the general harumphed before bending the pile of earth to refill the holes he had created. At the same time, he buried his dark thoughts with his usual gruffness. "The brats with Kylan." The cheery psychopath grinned brightly. "You know he's been promoted to colonel, right?" Yama rolled his eyes. "Colonel Brats with Kylan. They're happy." The captain chuckled as she gave his shoulder a pat before she walked on. "Never change, old man." "I'm not old." "Yes, you are, Grandpa," she replied over her shoulder. The imprisoned general let out a sigh, and then stomped off to his quarters. He'll not dwell on those dark memories anymore for today. Better to find something productive to do, like find something in this new camp that the brat needs fixing. With all the rumors swirling around the new rising star of the Fire Nation, Crown Prince Zuko felt some apprehension at the coming meeting. But Uncle Iroh had insisted for at least a courtesy visit to Colonel Xing annoyingly and understandingly. The colonel was almost never in his new residence. The nobles' quarters were a considerable distance away from the closest training grounds, and the 11th Regiment was assigned to a few hours away from the imperial city. That meant that Zuko had to spend a good chunk of his morning traveling out of the city with a small retinue. He'd announced his visit a day beforehand, of course. It'd be unwise to interrupt the colonel's work, so it was no surprise as they reached the regiment's training complex. Zuko saw a welcoming party. The hardened men and women in full armor, standing stock-still at attention, was intimidating enough. But somehow the boy in the middle of that group doing likewise almost made Zuko pause mid-stride. He radiated a confidence that was different from his sister. There was a surety in himself, but without much of Azula's sense of superiority, and none of the Fire Lord's mild contempt, at the very least, of everyone around him. Crown Prince Zuko, the boy with the hard gaze, greeted sharply, sharp enough to elicit a wince. "We are honored that you have made time to visit us." A cacophonous crash of metal on soil rose to the air as the officers of the 11th Regiment dropped to their knees. Zuko had to admit, it was very, very unnerving to receive the reception. Colonel Xing and his commanders displayed nothing but respect, if not for him, then for Zuko's station. He sensed none of the underlying condescension or pity that many of his father's advisors, and even the palace guards, did. These soldiers gave no judgment, no resentment at the prince's presence. It was elating for his spirits. Zuko stood straighter and adopted a bit of the royal sternness that his father and sister so easily wore. He managed what he thought was a suitably regal nod. "Colonel Xing, officers." "As you were." They rose as one, their gaze never directly meeting his. The boy colonel saluted again before he spoke. "What can we do for you, your highness?" "I've only come for a short tour," Zuko replied, repeating his uncle's suggestion. "Much praise has been given to the 11th. I would like to see for myself the might of its valiant warriors." Was he laying it too thick? Maybe he should tone it down a bit. "We are grateful for the opportunity, Prince Zuko," the colonel declared, and then turned his head ever so slightly. "Captains, begin the drills." "Mosey with me." "Yes, Colonel," the officers confirmed sharply, ignoring the fact that they had been given commands by someone about a decade their junior. Zuko was maybe starting to see the appeal of superior authority. Xing shifted to one side and ushered the prince in. "If you'll follow me, your highness." While he had done publicity tours of domestic forces, seeing a renowned force being put through its paces was something else. These men and women going through spear and fire-bending drills weren't trying to put on a show to please the visiting prince. They were doing so because they were ordered to. Zuko could even tell who the newer recruits were, because they were drilling out of genuine fear of their commanding officers. Even his escorts from the palace were showing signs of intimidation. These men and women were far more precise and economical in their movements. The spearmen jabbed and twisted their spears with swift ruthlessness, while firebenders blasted out flames with a harsh grace that the prince envied. What made everything even more awe-inspiring was the near silence these soldiers operated in. There were no war cries or expressive yelling. They might have been grunts and panting, but nothing was consciously being vocalized. An image flashed past the prince's mind, of a dozen of these spearmen advancing in silence and jabbing their spear tips through Earth Kingdom soldiers. Zuko suppressed a shudder at it. "As you can see, my prince, the recruits are still a little rough around the edges," Lieutenant Colonel Mosey explained. "But given that we have a few more months, we will have these soldiers ready to serve the Fire Nation in time." Zuko tried not to stare at the man and blink. This was rough around the edges? What did properly trained look like? Then he saw the veterans of the 1st Battalion, and Zuko understood the difference. And then he felt a bit sorry for the enemy. He toured through the facilities and the soldiers, managing to nod and offer brief replies to the commentary provided by the lieutenant colonel. Colonel Xing himself kept mostly silent, referring to glare death at the batch of troops currently on display. With the tour over, Zuko was ushered into the colonel's office, both for a break as well as to facilitate private conversation. With Mosey and the palace escorts left waiting outside, the two teens were the only ones in the room. "Your troops are impressive, Colonel," Zuko praised as he took a seat and accepted a bowl of tea. "I can see why many speak so highly of you and your regiment." He tried not to frown as he uttered that sentence. "I'm glad that they think so," Xing replied. "My uncle told me of the hardships you and your regiment endured all this while," Zuko said, clumsily shifting the conversation. "I am sorry for the losses you have gone through, The other boy interrupted with a dismissive wave of his hand, though his voice took on a harder edge. Was it the mention of the hardships or Uncle Iroh that caused it? It is of no consequence, Your Highness. The 11th will rebuild, and will continue to serve the Fire Nation. Zuko nodded, and then seized the opportunity he so obviously created. On that topic, I've been told you served as the regiment's strategist before this. The colonel's stiff pose softened, and the beginnings of a wistful smile threatened to form. It was unofficial. Colonel Li Dai and the other officers humored my suggestions and found ways to make it work. Is that so? For a moment, Zuko hesitated, but eventually he managed to fit in the right words. If it would not be too troublesome, could you explain to me some of the stratagems you've suggested that had worked? As Crown Prince Dash, no matter how much Father and Azula disliked his position, I should educate myself on military matters. That somehow caused Xing to smile with some warmth, and the colonel bowed in his seat. It would be my pleasure, Prince Zuko. I can work out a schedule for you if you wish. Don't let me interfere with your work. Zuko replied with what he hoped was a placating smile. I can come by when you have the time. As you wish, Your Highness. Since we have the time, is there anything in particular you'd like to delve into? I can have my officers bring in the relevant reports. Colonel, you've go dash. The soldier's hurried message was drowned out by the scornful voice of a princess. Is this where his office is? Ren turned her head in time to see the doors fly open as the teenage royal entered Xing's office, a scowl marring her otherwise pretty face. The poor private trying to warn them quickly melted out of vision as Princess Azula scanned the people in the room with a wrathful glance, before zeroing her sights on Xing. She didn't even deign to notice her brother in the room. There you are. The officers shot up to attention and saluted the princess, but she didn't seem to acknowledge any of them as she strode towards Xing like she was about to gut him. Prince Zuko tried to intercept her. Azula, what are you doing? He dashed. The princess, though, simply sidestepped him, never straying from her goal. Not now, brother. Your Highness, what can I do for you? Ren winced at the boy's unfazed politeness. She really should have taught him how to read a girl and get on her good side. Peeking upwards despite her bowed head, Ren saw Princess Azula's eyes narrow. Yeah, his stoic mask was definitely one of the worst approaches to this situation. You can start, Colonel, by clearing out the training yard for us. Once more the captain winced, and this time it was a sentiment shared by the other officers. How badly did Xing beat the princess that she would hound him 3 days later? Xing, though, twitched in surprise. Now, princess? Yes, now. This time, I'll not be caught by surprise. The colonel gave Prince Zuko a glance, who in turn gave a resigned nod. Xing then glanced at Mosey. Move the recruits from Yard B and reschedule the day's curriculum. As Mosey all but fled the room, Princess Azula whirled and stormed out, pausing only to turn to Xing once more. Well, are you coming? Run. The captains and the prince followed after a clearly annoyed Xing and a clearly infuriated princess. It was almost comical, if not for the very real possibility that her little brother might actually say something to further enrage the princess and earn himself her father's wrath. When they reached Yard B, the still vacating soldiers scampered to safety at the sight of the royal, leading their colonel to the center of the grounds. Princess Azula slipped smoothly into an orthodox combat stance. We will fight again, Colonel. This time I will not be caught off guard, nor will I go easy on you. Xing regarded her almost dumbly for a moment. Once more Prince Zuko tried to intervene, though it was the colonel that stopped him by answering first. As you wish, princess, he answered wearily, and then he straightened, leaning back a little with his arms lowered. Ren's jaw dropped, and she heard Kai gasp. Xing's using that against the princess? Is he trying to murder her? Ruffin whispered aloud. For a moment, the officers collectively thought of rushing in to stop the duel, even if the boy's hands and feet were not wreathed in flames. Non-bending soldiers had used the colonel's moves to lethal effect during night raids. The prince, understandably confused, looked to the officers with mounting concern. Murder? What's with that stance? Mosey let out an exasperated sigh. It's dangerous, Your Highness, but hopefully. And boy did he emphasize that word. The colonel knows what he is doing. The princess shot forwards with a cry, opening with a standard lunging dragon punch. Xing dodged the jet of flame along with the fist that followed alongside it, to Ren's horror, by leaping straight inside the punch to swing a knee up the princess' chin. Thankfully, she was nimble enough to disengage back, aborting the brutal sequence of hits that might have followed if she'd turned aside or blocked like many earthbenders had done. She used a tornado kick to force some distance between her and Xing, though he crouched under the gout of fire rather than negate or dodge it. He closed in instantly with a knife hand jab that forced the princess to abort her own winding punch, displaying her much-praised brilliance. Princess Azula did not take the opening to Xing's torso, and instead went for a swift backhand around the back of his head. Once more Xing's sequence was foiled, and he had to improvise with clawing strikes to her neck and chest. A swift kick rebuffed that, though he in turn retaliated with a kick of his own. Ren watched as the two young teens fought, uncaring that her jaws had dropped in amazement. Spirits, Ping mouthed in astonishment. Both combatants were locked in a flurry of attacks and counterattacks, meeting aggression with aggression. Only the fact that he kept his flames off told Ren that the colonel was doing at least a minimum of keeping the duel non-lethal. Not that the princess was holding back much, either. Her more traditional moves might be more showy, but she utilized them effectively, and it was clear she was trying to wipe the floor with Xing. The princess was keeping up with Xing, even forcing him back occasionally. She somehow saw past his feints and baits, though in many cases was unable to exploit them. Understandable, considering her orthodox foundation, but still very impressive. Slowly but surely, though, it seemed that Princess Azula was adapting to Xing's style and breaking the mold of conventional firebending. She's trying to put him into a position for a diving hawk kick, Mosey realized aloud. At that, Rin squinted a bit, and it suddenly became very obvious. Princess Azula's counterattacks were aimed at keeping Xing low and far enough for her to deliver a decisive downwards kick. She was being subtle about it, but not subtle enough that experienced spectators couldn't figure out the pattern being created. At least her opponent shouldn't notice it, though. Xing was working towards an endgame of his own, though Rin couldn't figure. "Oh, spirits," Wei Kong gasped. "He's going to try and tackle her." Ren's face, and that of her colleagues, snapped towards the captain. "You're joking," she said, then turned back to the fight, and then saw the way Xing always seemed to coil back a little, his arms ready to draw back. "Shit, do we intervene?" Kai asked. "We intervene, right? What's going on?" Prince Zuko asked, just about starting to panic. "Why do we have to intervene?" As they hesitated with an answer, Rin spied the princess successfully evading a stomp meant to break her ankles, and replied with a furious punch into Xing's chest. He actually leaned in to take the flaming hit before it reached its full strength, and let himself get pushed back instead of trying to resist the blow. Then the captain realized that the explosion of flames and smoke briefly obscured the princess' vision. It was enough for Xing to get into a familiar crouch. "Xing, no!" Neither combatant heard Ren's panicked cry. Princess Azula was pulling into a standard defensive stance as she awaited her opponent's next move. She should have kept moving, kept defying standard firebending practices. The girl should be already diving forwards or away, not priming herself to dole out more counterattacks. Xing lunged through the dissipating smoke, catching the princess off guard. Her arms were batted aside with savage sweeps before Xing fired a punch aimed to cave her face in. Or should have been aimed that way. Thankfully, the boy seemed to still have the presence of mind to remember not to kill the princess, and his fist instead filled the space beside Princess Azula's head. From where Ren was watching, it seemed like a spectacular column of blinding flame erupted from the back of the princess' head. Xing pulled back into attention, while the clearly stunned princess blinked her wide eyes several times. Rin was smart enough not to so much as smirk at the girl's dropped jaw. The two of them kept at the pose for a few comical seconds before Xing finally chose to speak. "I hope this is enough, princess?" "Arg, stupid boy." Kai and Wei Kong groaned, while Mosey simply pinched the bridge of his nose. Even the prince had recovered enough from his shock to wince. Princess Azula snapped out of her daze and stared at the colonel with incredulity, rage, and confusion. Then some of her regal composure returned, and she merely nodded as if nothing had happened. "That is a satisfactory performance, Colonel." The princess glanced at the officers, and then to the other not too discreet soldiers around the training yard. "Come, back to your office." "As you wish, princess." As Xing led the way, Rin caught the flash of a scowl on the princess' features, one filled with rage and hatred and, oh. She exhaled softly, feeling a grin tugging at her lips. "Oh, what?" Kai asked, to which Rin simply grinned even more. Nothing. The captain made to follow after her colonel and the princess. She caught the cute prince's gaze, but merely offered a sweet smile at him. "It'll be fine, Your Highness." "Well, it should be, I think." Ren almost broke into giggles when the princess later announced that, to ensure that her patronage was well invested, as well as to study firsthand the importance of logistics and strategy, Princess Azula would be personally attending to the 11th Regiment's rebuilding. The princess would also follow along the regiment for the first 2 months of its campaign, to observe their performance. And when she learned what Prince Zuko was doing, she enrolled herself in the same lessons, regardless of what her brother had to say on the matter. It looks like Xing would have to be put through a crash course for socializing with girls. As she spent more time with Xing, Azula was forced to admit that he was clearly someone worth respecting. She sparred and lost 2 more times to the boy. And though it was clear she was adapting to his style of combat, it was equally clear that there was still a significant gap between them. Azula did not care that his firebending was deemed ugly or improper. It worked, and it was highly effective. But try as she might to learn by watching him, Azula could never move or think fast enough to react. Oh, she got some hits in, but those didn't stop him from stopping his fist an inch from her face, or blasting another crater right beside her neck. They both knew that if it was a proper Agni Kai, Xing would be the one walking away on his own 2 feet. The firebending that most people knew, that she knew and mastered, was simply inadequate against Xing's once he got close. It was impressive, seeing how he channeled such intense flames without the usual sweeping or flowing movements to regulate and unleash his chi. Azula had tried replicating what he did, but she only managed the same weak licks of flame that came from the standard fire punches. Annoyingly, it seemed that Xing's fire-bending was unique to him. His officers admitted that nobody else could achieve what he did, though that didn't mean his moves were not worth adopting to some measure. Indeed, it was rather intriguing watching the new soldiers being trained up to the 11th to her 11th Regiment standards. The firebenders and non-benders alike practiced a form of Xing's martial combat, slamming their fists, elbows, knees, and other body parts against wooden posts. Men and women would literally break themselves against those posts for an hour or 2. It's to toughen them up against earthbenders, Captain Kai had helpfully, if somewhat patronizingly, explained. If we get really close to them, they can't throw rocks as easily unless they don't care about hitting their friends. But they sometimes manage to bring up a wall of earth. Mostly low integrity, but still enough to get in the way. Hopefully once we're done here, our newer soldiers will be able to break through rocks and soil without crying for mommy. How long would that take? The captain frowned for a moment in thought before shrugging. Until they can break the posts within a few minutes. Asking them to break rock is unrealistic, after all. Yeah, that's the job for the firebenders, Captain Weikong added rather excitedly. They'll start that training in a week's time, hopefully. But basically we'll be putting up piles of mortared rocks, and our firebenders will work towards breaking them using this form to firebend. The princess couldn't help but grin at that. I look forward to witnessing that. I'm sure the colonel would be more than happy to teach you, Your Highness, Captain Ren said with a smile that Azula found suspicious. But it was a valid idea. And so, Azula subsequently dragged Xing into putting her through the same training his soldiers were undergoing. Unfortunately, her brother had heard the news and joined in as well. It was a minor annoyance, but she had to begrudgingly respect her brother's attempt to better himself, even by a small margin. As reluctant as he was, Xing was an excellent teacher, compared to the bumbling tutors back in the palace, simply spewing what they read from scrolls. The colonel cared little about proper stances, and instead preferred explaining why you had to turn into an uppercut or a kick needed to be swept in a particular fashion. Bear in mind, Your Highnesses, that this method was made in response to fighting earthbenders, he had explained. So the emphasis is on speed and reflexes, as well as being uncomfortably close. We have to seize the initiative and force the enemy on a hasty defensive. That focus on speed up close was an approach that worked rather well on firebenders too, the princess noted. Traditional firebending often relied on using the flames to extend one's reach, and like earthbending, had few practical solutions to a scrappy in-your-face combat that did not involve disengaging. The moves Xing taught them were ruthlessly practical. There were elbow and knee strikes that were supposed to be charged with flames only on impact, and attacks aimed at various vulnerable spots to maximize damage. Incorporating fire bending into the moves would take time, But already Azula quickly learned the different approaches to snapping wrists and ankles, and landing debilitating strikes to the eyes, neck, and groin. With the aid of some volunteers, she and Zuko also learned how to keep multiple opponents engaged and eventually defeat them, often using one opponent as a shield. Xing also displayed how to use a curtain of flames to distract the enemy and leave them vulnerable to a flanking maneuver, something Azula was already acquainted with in her previous spars with him. It was surprising what one could achieve with just a brief burst of fire in a wide area. Supposedly, the soldiers made use of such distractions to aid in isolating groups of Earth Kingdom formations. As she greedily learned from the colonel, Azula had to admit that her brother was doing a good job at keeping up with her. His firebending might be lagging behind, but here in the training grounds of the 11th Regiment, firebending was secondary, and Zuko adopted Xing's moveset almost as quickly as she did. Almost. She still consistently beat him in their sparring, though it was a much closer thing than if they were firebending normally. Still, it was impressive to be able to impart such knowledge that elevated poor fighters like her brother to such a degree of competence. And all the officers of the 11th had unanimously agreed that Xing was the one who devised it. Much as he might want to protest, for some incomprehensible reason, they had only helped him refine the techniques. Everything the new soldiers of the 11th were learning was the brainchild of a boy far too young to enlist. Her thoughts of trying to best him turned into a desire to simply learn more from him. It was why she kept her eyes locked onto him, trying to uncover more about the orphan commander. For now, Azula focused on her lessons and her tutor. So far, she was slowly deciphering his body language, like the ghost of a smile he gave to his officers, or the degrees of satisfied nods he gave when Azula or Zuko were able to see through the hidden moves of his battle reports. That she felt a stirring of something whenever she gazed at him was disturbing, but it was a minor thing to be pondered on in her free time. There were more important things to work on, like adapting to Xing's combat style and understanding the old battles the regiment went through, and proving herself superior to her brother in those fields as well, of course. It did not hurt that she did not mind basking in the genuine praise Xing rationed out whenever she did something he thought commendable. The weird excitement at receiving his acknowledgement was nice, maybe a bit too nice, but compared to the sycophantic and hollow words from court, or the patronizing ones from the high generals, perhaps it didn't hurt to seek genuine commendation for one. Admittedly, Colonel Xing's briefings were interesting and far from a chore, even with Azula's constant need to show off. Zuko found the young commander to be respectful almost to a fault, and for some reason it annoyed his sister to no end. Xing was concise in his explanations of the 11th's strategies, and the prince found himself learning much about the different methods of waging war. Colonel Li Dai had focused on more conventional set-piece battles, preferring to force the Earth Kingdom formations into a defensive, and then chipping them into isolated, easily manageable groups or just overwhelming them by an exposed flank. It was standard, if not for the emphasis prioritizing the lives of his soldiers over a quick victory. Their tactics became far more unorthodox when Xing's suggestions were implemented. They feigned retreats that drew the Earth Kingdom armies into kill zones, and overcame larger armies by picking away at their supply trains and foraging teams. On two of the occasions that Xing had explained so far, the 11th baited the enemy into a chase, only for a second element to strike in the rear and take out the enemy commander. The 11th Regiment also began to adopt far less savory tactics, like night raids on enemy camps to capture or burn down supplies. Often, those same raids would be used to assassinate the enemy commander, or at least their officers. In one case, kidnap the enemy general before withdrawing and leaving the enemy to wither away. From what Zuko understood so far, the 11th's stratagems relied heavily upon gathering accurate information on an unsuspecting enemy. Not surprising then that the battalion scouts were held to a high standard and were paid almost as well as officers. There were also improvised weapons, like clay jars of flammable dung from Komodo rhinos and dragon moose. Those things emitted noxious smoke when burnt and thrown at enemy formations, and unless earthbenders quickly buried the flames, the fumes were potent enough to force units out of position. "I'm surprised none of this knowledge made it back here," Azula once said whilst frowning. "If all this has been proven effective, we should be getting the rest of our armies to adopt them as well." Xing's answer was simple enough. "Unfortunately, Our tactics work precisely because no one else is using them. Most of these tactics and stratagems require a heavy element of surprise to be successful, which is also why we try not to repeat their usage too often. It gives the enemy generals less chances to study what we have done and develop a counter to it. Barring the night raids, of course. Zuko had nodded in understanding then, but his sister had a point. Surely the Fire Nation's army would benefit from adopting your night attacks at least? The colonel gave a nonchalant shrug. That would depend on personal doctrines and preferences. I am aware that Colonels Shou and Yenshin have made effective use of them. But Colonel Dao, for example, prefers meeting the enemy head-on. A disapproving frown flashed across his face. Something about glory and merits. Well, there is that to consider. Azula conceded, though the look Xing tried to hide suggested he thought battle honors were a disgusting concept. She noticed it too, and leveled a demanding look at him. I'd have thought you of all people would find glory to be worth chasing. Xing, considering your promotion. Zuko immediately knew it was the wrong thing to say when he saw the cold outrage in Xing's eyes. Both royal siblings tensed at the surprising change in emotion. I did not seek this commission, Xing spat out. Glory was what got Colonel Li Dai ostracized by rivals who envied his success. Glory was what caused General Shirluo to so blindly throw away hundreds of lives. The boy calmed down right after and offered an apologetic bow. I'm sorry, Your Highnesses. That topic is a personal pet peeve of mine. Thankfully, Azula was more amused than offended, waving it off casually. Zuko thought he imagined some color in his sister's cheeks, but he definitely noticed her strange smirk. It's all right, Xing. I suppose the downsides of glory is something for us to consider in the future. What do you seek in victory, then? Zuko asked, ignoring his sister's annoyed gaze as he no doubt beat her to the question. Colonel Xing paused in thought for a moment before answering. One that preserves as many lives of my command, as Colonel Li Dai espoused. The fewer the casualties suffered, the greater I consider the victory. The siblings kept silent, allowing Xing to further elaborate. Zuko noticed his sister's judging stare, though. People are a resource that takes a lot of investment. Simply wasting them for something so abstract like glory is wasteful. Every spearman and firebender left unharmed at the end of battle is another one that can be immediately brought to bear in the next fight. The young commander broke into a grin as a thought seemed to have occurred to him. Besides, that should be a testament to skill and discipline, no? To be competent enough that you can reliably send the enemy back with their tails between their legs without suffering the losses that everyone else goes through. To claim solid victories without wasting Fire Nation lives. If it means I have to starve or poison my enemies into submission instead of facing them in battle, I will do so. If assassinating their commanding officers breaks their will to fight, then I will happily lead the death squads to slit their throats while they sleep. Azula seemed to like that, while the different perspective was genuinely refreshing to Zuko, despite it revealing Xing's more ruthless side. Looking to lives as a measure of competence, as well as a resource. That was something nobody in the War Council, or even Uncle Iroh, had spoken much about, if at all. It was a shame Xing was not around to help argue the case when Zuko spoke out against General Bujing. Dinner, Li Ming announced to the training yard before hurrying back to the mess hall to help prepare against the coming invasion. The wave of hungry, dead-eyed recruits shambled in, with small groups of exhausted but otherwise still lively veterans mixed within. Li Ming and her colleagues served them with equal efficiency, handing over trays of rice and meat and greens. It was only slightly later, while everyone was in the midst of gorging themselves, did the colonel appear. Xing took the meal as everyone else, sitting with a group of veterans. From what she understood, all this was different enough to be a bit scandalous to the upper classes. Officers were, according to Chia and the others, supposed to eat at their own separate tables with their own separate meals. Even Cranky Yama agreed that it was the same in the Earth Kingdom. The officers of the 11th were simply carrying over their habits from campaigning, though. As far as Li Ming knew, it was a habit set by Colonel Li Dai due to supply shortages. Anyone in the 11th, be they spearmen or colonel or camp staff, or even prisoners, shared the same limited menu. There was only a short period when that changed. But then again, little good came during Shirluo's short reign. Li Ming looked at the table of grizzled soldiers offering advice to their greener comrades. The newbies in another table were meekly nodding along as they were caught between Captain Kai's and Captain Ren's discussion. Probably about Xing again. Then she looked at the colonel's table, where he ate in silence, but wore a noticeable smile as the enlisted men and women around him conversed and joked. A sense of melancholy seeped into her, dragging with it the memories of the past. Li Ming tensed as she remembered the leering faces of her abusers, a bunch of Fire Nation garrison guards. She remembered the barracks door exploding open, almost literally. And what the hell is going on here? An armored giant growled softly, causing the molesters to flinch back. We were just interrogating a rebel, sir. She was Dash. Another figure stepped into view, an equally scarily armored woman with a face locked into a fiery scowl. Save it, dimwits. Leave. Now. Li Ming wanted to curl up when she felt the two figures' gazes fall on her. For a moment, when the giant of a man approached, she thought that he had simply wanted to keep her to himself. Then a dagger appeared, and before her fears could evolve, her arms fell free from the bedpost. Can you walk? The woman asked, far gentler than she'd expected. Li Ming gave a scared nod before rising up to her feet. The man draped a heavy cloak around her, and Li Ming was escorted out of the guard's barracks and introduced to a man far too old to be in such heavy warplate. Despite the imposing image, the old man radiated warmth and reassurance. I'm sorry for what you had to go through, he said in a voice too warm and kind for a Fire Nation butcher. I'll have Lieutenant Ren escort you back to your family. You have my word that those men will trouble you no more. When she told them she had no family to return to, the old man's eyes softened with sorrow before he offered her a place with them. It's a bit of rough traveling, but you'll be paid, and I can assure you that no harm will come to you. They did not ask her whether she was really a rebel or an Earth Kingdom saboteur. Even now, none of the 11th cared that Li Ming was a former Earth Kingdom villager. The moment she accepted, she was treated like every other camp follower. They trusted her with their laundry at first, and then later their meals. The strange young boy who called himself Xing would notice her worry when she began serving in the kitchen, and try to alleviate it with jokes and feigning food poisoning from evil Earth Kingdom ingredients. Li Ming missed his bright smile. Colonel Li Dai's passing dealt a blow to the boy that dimmed it, but Shirlua's cursed actions all but smothered the youthful joy in Xing. She remembered sobbing with the others and desperately closing her eyes and ears as the crack of the whip filled the air that night. She remembered the shouting, the beginnings of violence, and the arrival of Colonel Dao. She remembered the day before the battle, where Xing brought her into the prisoner's tent just as he was about to let them loose. You'll be safe with them, the boy had assured her with a brittle smile. If you encounter the Earth Kingdom, you can say we forced you to work for us. He left with camp guards and followers, ignoring the shouts of Shirlua's people. Li Ming remembered the shock she felt back then, followed quickly by a deep outrage. How dare he leave her here? After her time with the 11th, was she not a part of them? Did she not earn the right to join them? Even in an impossible attempt, a rattle shook Li Ming out of her thoughts, and she saw Xing looking at her curiously, with a bowl in hand. All good, Li Ming? She banished the bad memories with a shake of her head. Yes, Colonel. Here, I'll get you topped up. She took the empty bowl and packed the rice in tightly, making sure the growing boy ate his fill. Here you go, sir. I've made sure not to poison it. Xing replied with a lopsided smile. Thanks, Li Ming. As she watched the colonel return to his seat, another voice drew Li Ming's attention. Everything all right? Mosey stood just to the side, his sharp face furrowed a little in a frown. Li Ming knew better than to try deflecting too blatantly. I was just thinking. He raised an eyebrow in concern. Old times. Yeah, she replied with a slow nod. Old times. Bad times. Mosey reached out, and Li Ming gladly took his proffered hand and squeezed it tightly. Things will be fine, he reassured her, and Li Ming gladly believed it. She gave the lieutenant colonel a grateful smile. You're done with your meal? At Mosey's nod, Li Ming managed a smirk, then led him out the mess hall's side doors. Nobody that noticed made a scene out of it, and the new kitchen crew needed to learn how to work with reduced manpower anyway. As the regiment's quartermaster, and having gone through battle after battle with improvised equipment and desperate scrounging, Hyung was glad to be spending so much time going through the new gear and supplies allotted to the 11th Regiment. Pai and his crew could now rely on new anvils instead of the pitted, warped metal chunks. The chefs now had actual cooking knives and utensils, instead of resorting to combat blades and sharpened sticks. And after the last 2 grueling years, Hyung and his fellows swapped out civilian or Earth Kingdom footwear for proper regulation ones. The civvy ones donated by well-meaning colonists were too thin and tore easily, while the Earth Kingdom ones, from their non-benders of course, were noticeably heavy enough that it affected marching. Royal decree also ensured that any request was met, no matter how outlandish it might seem. Colonel Xing, of course, took advantage of that by ordering in new heavy coats for everyone and crates of small metal plates. It was up to Xing and some vets he volunteered to rivet the plates into the coats. It might be a bit improvised, but this new brigandine armor promised far more protection than regulation armor. Xing should know. The primitive versions Xing had convinced him to cobble together held up all the way to Tai Plains. It was heavier overall, but the balance between protection and freedom of movement was far better compared to the stiff cuirass the conventional infantry had to deal with. If the colonel didn't have to worry about the dragon mushit that was court politics, the armor design would likely have proliferated throughout the Fire Nation military by now. Orders for new helmets trickled in as well, intimidating things with chainmail woven underneath the nasal guards to protect the lower face and neck. Again, heavier, but the protection from stray rocks getting stuck in cheeks and throats was very well worth it in Hyung's experienced opinion. Besides, that's what the training's for. If the newbies can't handle a little weight, how would they handle earthbenders throwing boulders at them? It was good that the colonel wanted everyone to wear the kit, firebender or otherwise. With no visible differentiation between them, the Earth Kingdom might find it hard to react appropriately. Plus, the quartermaster had to admit that seeing everyone in the same intimidating gear would be damned impressive. Spirits. Even just going through the list of a spearman's equipment made Hyung grin. Brigandine armor with shoulder, wrist, and shin guards, a good pair of boots, a mailed helmet, one short sword on the belt, one chisel dagger also on the belt, another chisel dagger hidden under foot traps, no less than 2 herbal pouches, and finally whatever their primary weapon was. Of course, many of the veterans opted for carrying more daggers on them. As hardy as the weapons were, no doubt they'd be blunted after breaking through several earthbender walls, which was why Hyung was glad the 11th would have cartfuls of spare weapons traveling with them. Beyond the necessities, the colonel had materials for his various secret weapons pouring in. Normally, Hyung would be pissed as all hell to have to figure out how to safely store fragile clay pots, unwieldy leather fabrics, alchemical ingredients, and odd-shaped metal objects. But the young colonel's little projects had always proven very spectacular, enough that it reduced the annoyance to a necessary inconvenience. Hyung looked forward to seeing the newbies' reactions when those toys eventually came out to play. It might have been a mistake signing up as the colonel's bodyguard, Wufong thought. Not for the first time as he fended off the sudden ambush in the mess hall. Lieutenant Koshi was taking this a bit too seriously, secretly conscripting various troopers to harass the inductees at random points of the day. To be fair, Wufong and his mates were also allowed to select their own eager gang to do the same to the lieutenant. They were jumped right after training, during their break, right after mealtime, always when at their most vulnerable and or spent. As annoying as it was, Wufong could see the point of it. Koshi was still flagellating himself over his perceived weakness, and vowed to make sure he and anyone who guarded the beloved colonel would not suffer a repeat of that disgrace, which was also why they practiced fighting indoors, in pitch darkness, while outnumbered, without firebending, with freaking live steel, and Koshi only accepted non-grievous incapacitation to allow for interrogation of future assassins. It was insane, even for the standards of the battle-tested veterans. But by the end of it all, Wufong had to begrudgingly admit that the methods had made him much more aware and much more responsive than before. It only took 3 weeks of unpredictable ambushes to get them up to that level, where Wufong now could pick up on minute details in his surroundings. Like how, whenever the prince and princess visited, their royal escorts were becoming more and more complacent. They might not be slouching, but their relaxed postures meant that it would take more precious seconds before they could focus their chi into flames, or react to sudden threats. The royal escorts were becoming more like curious spectators than actual guards, or the interesting dynamics between the 2 royal siblings. It was not Wufong's business, but Princess Azula was visibly dominant and almost outright hostile towards her elder brother, whereas Prince Zuko was apprehensive of his sister's attention, but was trying to smoothen their relations. Wufong wished the prince all the best, but really, it wasn't his business. Something more relevant was the way the princess interacted with the colonel. She was dismissive at times, even antagonistic, one might say. But her insults carried no heat, and her occasional bouts of frustration was not something to worry about. Wufang recognized the confused rage she expressed, and let the colonel handle it. Wufang was a bodyguard after all, and his duties did not include handling teenage infatuation. Maybe unless the princess suddenly decided to tie Xing down to a bed. Another interesting observation was the amount of letters Wufang and the other bodyguards had to deal with. Colonel Xing's sudden rise to colonel also saw a sudden flood of letters from nobles and merchants. He'd given them the permission and task to go through them and figure out which were worth his time, which might be threats, which warranted an immediate response, and which could be ignored. A lot of the mail for the colonel fell into the latter category. According to Lieutenant Koshi, most of the nobles trying to gain the colonel's attention were inconsequential and wastes of time. Wufang quickly learned how to pick out groveling essays and torch them in under 3 seconds before moving on to the next, hopefully more important letter. Whether it be an appeal to take on some scion into the regiment, or a dinner to meet with some noble's daughter, or even a delusional request by some fresh graduate from the academy, the bodyguards dutifully purged the waste of good paper from the colonel's desk. Thankfully, there were no threats, overt or otherwise, to worry about, but a considerable amount of merchants were keen on joining the princess bandwagon to offer some sort of sponsorship. Some crazy merchant wanted to show the superiority of Fire Nation Kylon over Earth Kingdom cabbages by guaranteeing supply of the greens to the 11th throughout the regiment's campaigning. Something about using the 11th's victories as proof of cabbage's inferiority. Somehow, the colonel actually visited that merchant in person to politely reject the offer. It made sense. After years in Earth Kingdom territory, most of the vets in the 11th grew accustomed to cabbages. Wufang also learned that some invitations were best responded to, particularly from the higher nobility and influential guild leaders. Enviably, Lieutenant Koshi was the only one that the colonel requested to follow along on those visits, leaving Wufang and his colleagues with the arduous task of sifting through letters whenever they weren't busy being ambushed. It took 6 months of training before the 11th Regiment was ready to be deployed once more. By now unofficially known as Azula's Lancers, the War Ministry was still dallying about with approving that, annoyingly, they left for the colonies with relatively little fanfare. That Azula would be joining them ensured that a sizable crowd was gathered at least, and Zuzu seeing them off also added to the royal court's presence. By now, Zuko had improved himself to earn some of Azula's respect. Xing's training and lessons had forged her brother to something more princely. Zuko stood straighter and deliberated over things more decisively, but it came at the cost of being less gullible to his sister's needling and attempts at manipulation. Perhaps Xing was too competent as a mentor. Still, Azula had to admit that their joint training under the colonel had renewed some sort of sibling bond between them. Zuko still had his soft spots, especially over sacrificing lives, but at least she could understand where he might be coming from thanks to Xing's insights. After all, what's the point of being a ruler if you had no one to rule over, right? It was disappointing that their father did not seem too interested in the idea of human resource, though. The boy's ideas might hold some merit, but that does not mean it should replace our tried and tested plans. We are at war. You should know we cannot afford to coddle naive ideas. The Fire Lord had been firm in his stance, but Azula couldn't shake off the niggling doubt that her father might actually be wrong for once. Regardless of that minor disagreement, her father seemed impressed enough with Xing that the boy was personally summoned to court to receive the 11th Regiment's new orders. Azula remembered smiling as she watched the stern boy march out in the armor he had designed. It was a shame that helmets were not allowed to be worn in court. She thought it completed the look rather well. It also hid the very subtle annoyance he betrayed at having to be called out here. Really, the boy's aversion to politics was probably his biggest weakness. A good thing he more than made up for it with other qualities. The 11th Regiment was ordered to aid in the subjugation of Qinbao, the northernmost Earth Kingdom state. This was supposed to be a chance for the colonel and his regiment to prove himself. Considering she would only be with them for 2 months, Azula highly doubted she'd see how well they would fare there. But their route would take them across unruly towns and villages, and there was already a large Earth Kingdom army marauding dangerously close to some colonies, so she should still have the chance to see Xing and 11th shine. Just to be sure, Azula made it an order for her regiment to hunt down that army first. a rather useful perk of being a royal patron. In the meantime, the girl made use of the boring seaborne journey by training with the soldiers and getting acquainted with tactics and battle jargon that Xing and his officers only now deemed suitable to teach. Can't have lazy nobles picking up all this and claiming it as their idea when we pull it off successfully, Ping bluntly said, and Azula had to agree. After the disgraceful display of Duke Cho and the lack of support from the capital in general, it was understandable that the 11th Regiment fostered some distrust. In fact, as princess, she heartily approved of it. The less of Xing's ideas that anyone else dared steal, the more credible his victories, and more to the point, the more the princess would be vindicated in her decision to support the regiment. She did not care to waste time putting patronizing and sniveling nobles in their place. Of course, the new information also brought up new questions. Do those words even have a meaning? She asked with a mildly perplexed frown. I mean, I can imagine how you came up with Faraga. But what is Spartan or Asan? Just nonsense words I strung together, Xing, rather frustratingly, answered casually. It seemed that as soon as they left the capital, the colonel loosened up significantly. He was more willing to grin and trade dry jokes as they embarked and weighed anchor. By the time the city was a sinking speck in the horizon, Xing was noticeably far less stiff than he used to be. Run, and the others gave a shrug when Azula sought them out without his presence later that day. The colonel's been doing that for a while now. Colonel Li Dai thought it's because he hears the spirits from when we rescued him. Azula arched an eyebrow up in doubt. Is that so? But now that the captain mentioned it, how did you find Xing? All we heard from the capital was that Li Dai rescued and adopted him. The officers and overhearing soldiers became annoyingly somber at that, shoulders drooping and frowns blooming. We were chasing some Earth Kingdom marauders, Kai said softly, after looking over his shoulder to be sure that Xing was still busy with Mosey. We were down to just a day behind them when we reached Falun Town. We saw the smoke long before we saw the town itself, Ruffin muttered, shaking his head. Colonel Li Dai force-marched us, but the marauders were well done with the place by the time we got there. Azula kept silent as the soldiers took on a faraway look. Captain Run was flexing her fingers, while Lieutenant Kaysen blinked rapidly. It took seconds of patient waiting before Ruffin continued. The place was sacked and all but razed. The town wall was buried under mounds of dirt. The guards we managed to find were pinned to walls by earth spikes or crushed to paste under boulders. The colonists were butchered on the streets as they tried to flee. The captain's voice faltered, and it surprised the princess that the cheerily violent men and women around here were being overcome with emotion. She could see their eyes glisten. Some of the bodies we recovered. Some were so crushed we couldn't recognize if they were men or women, boys or girls. Some heads were shaking. Others were simply staring off into space with their arms trembling. And then Rindash, I heard a noise, the captain interrupted, her voice a choked whisper. Under a buried house. Collapsed under earthbender dirt and rock. Azula visibly reeled back as the usually cheery captain stared at her with teary eyes. It was cold and hollow, like gazing down an empty well. I had everyone digging. Sent word to the colonel. And he got everyone else to help. Captain Rin sniffed and flicked away the tears with a curled finger before shaking her head and drawing in a deep breath. We found Xing quickly, just a few feet away from the crushed door. A woman, his mother we think, was curled up above him, protected him from everything collapsing on top of them. Barely recognizable, if not for her robes. Sleeping robes. Spirits. He was still alive somehow, but he was so weak. So dirty. Kai took over the story as he draped a comforting arm around his colleague. We had to be careful. He had so many bones broken, like a stuffed doll. None of us thought he'd make it. Colonel Li Dai asked us to bring him along. Make sure his last moments were with people who could comfort him. After a slow exhale, Kai's gaze, and those of many around him, hardened with hate. We cremated those bodies we could recover, then hunted the partisans down. By the TI dash, what conspiracy is going on over there? Xing's rather cheery voice suddenly came from behind the group, interrupting the tale. Immediately the officers and the enlisted straightened to attention, wiping away wet eyes before they turned to face their colonel. Nothing, Colonel, Ping quickly answered with a betraying sniff. Just talking, still digesting the information. Azula only blinked several times at Xing, taking a while before she found and wore her royal composure. Xing, sharp as he was, noted the lingering emotions on his men and women, and it seemed to infect him as well. "I see." He gave a curt nod, and then turned to leave the deck. "Meeting in my office, whenever you're all ready." As they collected themselves and made to follow after him, Azula was struck by a sudden spike of envy. The raw emotions these professional killers had shown, the unabashed love they displayed when talking about Xing. Hardened warriors, utter strangers. Yet somehow when they found Xing, the images of her forever concerned mother, her distant father, even Uncle Iroh, all flashed through the princess' head. She compared them to these soldiers, and the spike grew barbs and twisted in Azula's guts. She quickly quashed down the emotion, forcing a stoic expression that could rival the colonel's before she followed along the officers. Azula was conscious of how she placed one foot in front of another. It would be unseemly if she stomped or stumbled across the deck, and it helped distract her from the ugly feeling welling up inside her. Perhaps it was a mistake to reveal that much about Xing. Kai noted the princess becoming rather tense as she attended the briefing. Her gaze hardened every now and then for some reason. Maybe Princess Azula's bond with Xing had grown close enough that she was trying to come to terms with his tragedy? Or was it just the case of a privileged royal trying to wrap her head around the brutality of Earth Kingdom reprisals? Regardless, over the next few days, the princess' interactions with everyone, Xing in particular, was a bit more distant, aloof. Of course, Xing noticed it, but tackled it in a convoluted manner. It had been 4 days since they left the capital when Xing announced a competition of prowess and talent. It was a chance to show off and potentially win half a colonel's pay. Anyone could participate, showing off anything they thought worthwhile, and everyone aboard would be the judge. Captain Luo happily agreed to include the crew of his ship in the competition. Sergeant Han of Araka village drew the shortest straw and went first. The small man opened the competition by whistling a folk song, "Dragon by the River," if Kai remembered rightly, in one breath. Chorus, additional verses, and all. Soldiers and sailors alike applauded at the admirable attempt, with some egging one another to replicate the feat. Then Ruffin was up, and he just pulled out an old but reliable party trick. The captain juggled daggers and swords, and then rolled over into a headstand without breaking the juggling. He would have finished by throwing the blades one after another into the same spot on the ground. But the ship was rocked by a large enough wave that almost lost him a few toes. Laughs of commiseration and mocking rang out as the shaken captain grumbled his way out into the crowd. Princess Azula was initially hesitant, keeping her haughty mask as the event began. But Kai noticed her loosening up right as a sailor did a surprisingly clean rendition of the play Butterfly's Lament. It was weird seeing a weathered man doing a fire-bending dance meant for a noble maiden, but the precise jets of flames paired with an unusually smooth and delicate choreography was quite impressive. The sailor bowed to thunderous applause and gave a grateful salute to a smirking and amused princess who joined along with a bit more royal restraint. More performances continued throughout the day, some familiar, some truly novel. Many were decent, a few were impressive failures, and fewer still were actually noteworthy. Ren did her usual handstand into dagger throws with her toes. Mosey got persuaded by his girlfriend to show off his singing voice, and even Captain Luo put up a spectacular masked opera show, using hastily painted rags. As the sun went down, the contestants were about to be judged, until Xing drew everyone's attention by directing a question to Princess Azula's way. "Princess, would you forgive me my rudeness of inquiring if you'd wish to show us how outclassed we are?" "Damn it, Xing." Kai and some others groaned at Xing's utter lack of finesse. Captain Luo's jaw dropped so fast that it could have dislocated. Thankfully, the princess seemed only curious at the young colonel's blunt question. She regarded him for a moment before nodding and rising up from her cushioned seat. The sailors and troops' cheer drowned out the sighs of relief. Kai watched as the young royal walked into the center of the performance ring, with very little in her posture betraying her nerves. She stopped right at the center, fixing Xing a stare. "I'll need a volunteer," she said, making it clear who was being volunteered. Soon, Xing was standing with wooden plates held up in each hand before the princess, who wielded a pair of naval cutlasses. The space behind him was cleared. A sense of trepidation rose in Kai as he noticed the princess grin, and it didn't help that her bodyguard retinue were looking rather nervous. Princess Azula visibly drew in a breath before she lashed out without further warning. Gasps echoed off the metal deck as the princess spun in place while she slashed and stabbed the blades at Xing with supreme confidence. It looked like a ceremonial war dance sans the fire bending. A dull crack sounded from each strike, and small chips of wood could be seen flying in the air. Xing stood utterly still as the blades slashed across or swept diagonally right in front of his face. His eyes remained open, locked with the princess' own grinning gaze. The flurry of cutlass strikes ended in just under 15 seconds, and Princess Azula finished it off by leaping back in a somersault and punching out with both fists before she landed. Twin jets of flame blasted at the scarred and chipped plates, breaking it apart. As the princess rose, Kai and the other odd spectators looked to what was left in Xing's hands. The smoldering characters of fire in his right hand and nation in his left. The words were carved so neatly that Kai could easily see himself mistaking it as a decent signmaker's work at first glance. The colonel himself was unaffected, save for maybe a bit of a heat flush on his face. Silence settled for just a second, long enough for the princess to start to glance at everyone around her. Then the collective cheers startled her a bit. She'd probably deny it, no doubt, with Kai roaring along with everyone else at the display. Princess Azula looked a bit confused for a moment, but then settled into basking in the moment with a rather satisfied smile. Xing had to take a few seconds to calm everyone down before he stated the obvious. So, is it safe to say that Her Highness Princess Azula wins this competition? Another round of cheers went up. The princess looked suitably flattered, and as Xing offered her the pouch of coins, she made a good show of having it distributed to the runner-ups instead. More cheers rose up, and someone began chanting her name. It was a chant soon picked up by pretty much the whole ship. "I'm surprised you kept still," Kai heard the princess say as she passed him with Xing in tow. "The real trick was supposed to be me making the carving before the plates dropped. I apologize for not playing along," Xing said with a ghost of a grin. "But when a princess tells me to stay still, I stay still." The princess snorted. "A shame none of my tutors have ever gotten that in their head." Xing gave a short chuckle. "I can imagine having to deal with untested masters might be taxing." Kai and the others did their level best to blend into the background as the princess turned around to give Xing a look. "Ugh, if only they were only merely taxing. Well, I'm glad your spirits seem to have lifted, princess." "Oh, for hell's sake, Xing." There was a light clapping of palms against faces, though thankfully it didn't distract both teens. Captain Luo looked like he wanted to replace his face with Xing's, and Kai didn't begrudge him that. Thank you, Xing," the princess replied, and everyone else did their best to not notice the weird air hanging around like a localized mist. After a few seconds of silence, Princess Azula retired to her quarters, followed by a massive collective sigh that threatened to be heard above the cheering as the anticipation deflated. Xing turned just in time for Captain Luo to bear down on him with all the disappointment of a seasoned tavern hopper. "Young man, being young does not mean you have to be so dense. Welcome to our world, Captain," Rin said wryly as she joined the fray. Kai and Ruffin just chuckled in agreement, while Ping was still rubbing her forehead. Mosey was being consoled by a giggling Li Ming. "What?" Xing asked obliviously, staring at the adults surrounding him. The 11th Regiment landed to some fanfare, as the port town of Zilong had a respectable turnout of colonists who had not forgotten their saviors. As the boarding ramp dropped and armored boots slowly marched down, the governor bowed deeply in respect to the arriving soldiers. When Azula appeared, he and his retinue dropped to their knees with appropriate deference. "The town of Zilong happily welcomes the royal princess and her valiant warriors," the one-armed governor declared in a clear, unshaking voice once her feet set foot on solid ground. Azula smiled at the gratitude and respect she was receiving. Deference without too much fear was a nice change. That the colonists were clearly far more enamored with the soldiers of the regiment than worried about her presence here was a novel experience, but one that the princess ignored. After all, it was her regiment, so any accolades and praises it received was also indirectly meant for her. And based on the briefings, this town had every right to look up to the 11th. Colonel Li Dai had fended off a rather stubborn Earth Kingdom force from the region several times, and Xing had concocted a brilliant plan that snuffed the raiders out completely right outside the town walls. Azula had skimmed through the reports, but it basically involved baiting the earth-bending marauders into besieging the emptied town, and then crushing them in a decisive flanking attack. The victory that followed earned Colonel Li Dai a main street and a memorial in Zilong when they heard of his passing. Supposedly, Xing and a group of daring volunteers, Lieutenant Run and Captain Kai included, because of course they were, served as the anvil, keeping the Earth Kingdom army at the walls. The boy was somehow credited with seizing the heads of 5 Earth Kingdom lieutenants, 2 captains, and 2 champions. Most of them were claimed at the same time, Ren had helpfully explained. You've seen Xing's firebending, Your Highness. The enemy were running up their earth-bended dirt ramp when Xing popped his head up and then exploded the lot of them away. It was just convenient that he aimed for center mass, left their heads intact enough for the prisoners to identify. Remembering the white flames, Azula nodded her understanding and couldn't fully keep herself from grinning at picturing Xing adopting a stance and erasing the insolent enemies. And as of late, just imagining the boy in any form made the princess feel funny. She had her growing suspicions about it, but it was a revelation that Azula was more than happy to postpone for as long as she could. Speaking of which, the princess could hear Xing walking up just behind her to salute the rising governor. Governor Day. Any Earth Kingdom troublemakers nearby to deal with by any chance? Azula noted the governor's scarred and mildly deformed face warping into a smile, his right sleeve flat against his sides due to the lack of a whole arm. The princess saw his disfigurement as an impressive display of the man's character. He had survived an early Earth Kingdom raid, cutting off his trapped limb and digging himself out of a pile of rubble. According to the soldiers who were there, Colonel Li Dai had appealed for him to retain his governorship, rather than allow for the colonial ministry to replace the crippled civil servant. It seemed to be the correct decision, considering Zilong's relative prosperity. That Governor Day still served despite several nobles back home eyeing his position spoke rather well of his competence. Sheik Colonel Xing. Unfortunately, none of them have dared trespass too deeply in the region ever since your regiment broke the last group. A shame, Xing said, feigning irritation. Governor Day's eyes twinkled with dark mischief. Quite so. It's inconsiderate of them, considering the efforts we've taken to prepare for their next visit. Azula allowed them and the surrounding soldiers and colonists their chuckles, and then followed the governor to his estate, where she and the officers of the 11th would be housed for the night. Are you sure you do not wish to rest a few nights before heading out? Governor Day asked. Xing glanced at Azula, waiting for her nod before he answered. The 11th Regiment cannot dally about too much. The Fire Lord has ordered us to provide our aid and prove our worth as soon as possible. And I would like to see how this regiment performs before I return, Princess added. There are some who worry that Colonel Xing here might be a poor choice to lead. The governor frowned at that, managing to hide most of his disgust. If I may be frank, Your Highness, Colonel Xing here is a worthy successor to Colonel Li Dai. Many in the colonies would easily place their trust in him despite his youth, rather than rely on an untested appointment from the capital. Perhaps before this, Azula might have found the governor's words to be insolent, treasonous even, for questioning the decisions of the royal court. But now she only found herself amused and agreeing with the scarred man. Besides, he was voicing his veiled disgust at the corrupt nobles who allowed the travesty of Shirluo to happen, not her or her father. I agree, she replied with a firm nod, ignoring how the governor shifted in place. That is why I have granted the 11th my patronage, and why I will be observing the regiment for a while to see for myself Colonel Xing's competence as a commander. Your Highness is most gracious to protect the regiment from the politics of nobles. Azula blinked. This governor was about the first person outside of father and the regiment to see her patronage as protection from court interference, and not a young princess trying to play general. The princess decided she liked Governor Day. Maybe once she returned to the capital, she would see to his own web of politics, see if there were any tangled knots that needed a little royal snipping. In the meantime, Azula grinned at the genuine praise. Indeed, so many short-sighted nobles who only see Xing as a mere boy, even if he's already vouched for by several notable commanders. She then turned to Xing with a smirk of superiority. See, Governor Day understands the importance of your regiment's patronage. Xing rolled his eyes and then slowly stooped into a bow and salute. I thank you for your trust in my abilities, Your Highness. Even with the deadpan delivery, for some reason Azula's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the insolence of his familiarity. Was it? Did she really find the casual treatment so enjoyable? Well, quite. Now, let us move on to more important topics. Beyond the necessary audience with the more, relatively, influential locals before dinner. The short stay in Xilong was unremarkable.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.